The drive to the cabin is exactly what Emma needed to get her mind wrapped around her new life. The last 6 months had felt like utter chaos after the divorce. Having to move into a new place, rearranging her smaller budget. Hell, she even had to get a new Netflix account. It felt like the world was going to twist the dagger as long as possible. And then the way people treated her. All Emma wanted to do was get back to normal, or at least whatever the new normal would be. But people talking to her like every word could break her, it's a divorce, not death, right? The road to her grandfather's cabin was a winding path void of structures. The dense wilderness surrounded her from all sides. Small brushes clumped to the side of the road, desperate to try to reclaim the ground taken by the unnatural asphalt. Her grandfather had passed away a year back of a heart attack. Apparently, he had been spending almost all of his time in the cabin before he passed. Emma's grandmother had no desire to visit the cabin, so she asked her if she wanted to stay at the remote location and help get it ready to sell. She guessed her grandmother had no desire to visit the location where he had had the heart attack. The idea of him being alone when it happened made her shudder. She had to push away the thought and focus on the task at hand. Emma needed the rent-free bed, and her grandmother needed the help. This would be an excellent opportunity for her to work. Emma created digital artwork for clients, which provided her with a flexible schedule and a bit more freedom. She loved her work, but she had not taken on a contract in the last 6 months. Emma turned off the main road onto a dirt path that led to the cabin. Her small car struggled with the uneven trail. She could feel her tires gaining and then losing traction. Emma grabbed her phone and paused the music as she slowly made the final stretch of the trip. She chuckled to herself about how that made no sense. Like her tires would somehow work better without the music, but she had to admit it did somehow feel safer. After a tense 10-minute drive, she saw the cabin crest the hill. Other than some downed branches and leaves covering the front porch, it looked like it was in good shape. She parked the car and got out to inspect the property. The grass was tall, but the stone steps leading up to the front door made the walk manageable. She pulled on the screen door and noticed it was locked. It felt heavy for a screen door. Was it made out of iron? Emma got out the keys for the property and unlocked the screen door. She then started working on the locks on the main door. It suddenly dawned on her that the front door had 3 deadbolt locks. When did Grandpa get so crazy about security? It took a moment for her eyes to adjust to the lack of light in the cabin. It had a faint, musty smell like stale air. Emma reached out to flip on the light switch. The living room was suddenly bright and inviting again. Well, at least the electricity is still on. She set her bag on the floor and went to look at the router on the side table. All the lights blinked with activity and the globe symbol glowed at the bottom. "I'm guessing I have internet as well," said Emma under her breath. She took a moment to look through each room. She figured she should take inventory since it would be her responsibility to get things packed up over the next couple of months. The main bedroom had a gun safe she did not remember seeing before. Emma never thought her grandpa was interested in hunting. She gave it a slight tug on the handle, and to her surprise it opened. She decided to close it. Guns made her slightly uncomfortable. Emma was also surprised to learn that a security system had been installed. When she turned on the TV, a view of all 5 outdoor cameras came up. It even looked like the laptop at the desk was set to view footage stored on the cloud. The thought of her grandfather joining the 21st century made Emma smile. He always was willing to learn something new. He stayed sharp till the very end. She decided that was enough poking around, plenty of time to look through her grandfather's things when she packed up the place over the next couple of months. Now she needed to earn a paycheck to get that nest egg going, and the only way to do that was to get on her laptop and complete some work. The hours melted away with little effort. The quiet of the cabin in the woods unlocked the full depths of her creativity. The trees wrapped around the remote structure, keeping the secrets within a mystery to all. Not a single creature seemed to stir in the dense foliage. Emma had not been this productive in months. After completing the contract and sending it over by email to her client, she celebrated with a bottle of wine she found in the cabinet. It was cheap, but the warm feeling felt good as she watched the sun descend below the tree line. She hoped this would be the first of many successful days of work here at the cabin. This area was perfect for long hours of uninterrupted work. It suddenly dawned on her that she had not seen any wildlife. Even the birds appeared to be absent from the scene. Perhaps she would invest in a bird feeder the next time she was in town. With nothing else left to do, she started poking around her grandfather's desk. He had a stone arrowhead, books, and printed out documents covering it. She picked up one of the books and thumbed through it. The title, The Missing Tribes of Native America, seemed like something her grandfather would have enjoyed. It brought her back to being a kid and remembering the annual trips to Florida. He used to love telling her historical facts on long road trip drives when everyone else had fallen asleep. Emma noticed the printed out documents looked like web pages about the mound builders and theories on what happened to the tribes. Some of them pointed to possible locations for unexplored mounds. The locations highlighted happened to be near the cabin. Was he looking for Indian artifacts? Emma then saw a hastily written note at the bottom of one of the pages. As she read the sentence, she felt the blood drain from her face. The mound is still occupied. Her mind quickly put away the thought. What did that even mean? Someone else owned the land is what she settled on. Just an odd way of putting it, Grandpa. Her focus then moved to the laptop. Emma tried the power button, but nothing came on. She checked the back and noticed the power cable was not plugged in. She reinserted the cable and finished her coffee cup of wine. The slight feeling of intoxication made her feel a bit detached from the situation. Exactly what she needed to be looking through her grandfather's notes. Emma pressed in the power button again, and the computer screen came to life. It took a moment for the PC to load. He had lots of icons on the desktop. As far as she could tell, it had no real method of organization. However, one folder caught her eye called Mounds. Emma opened the folder and found a list of MP4 files titled by different dates. She decided to pick one at random and open it. The glow of the forest footage lit up Emma's face. It looked like a cell phone video her grandpa took in the woods. He was breathing heavy in the video and kept dropping his phone to the side. After a 30-second clip of looking at the side of her grandpa's leg, the camera came back up to focus on a cleared area of land. A swirl of mounds covered the forest floor. One large mound was at the center of the smaller ones, almost like an altar or centerpiece. The camera began to move towards the larger mound, but then suddenly cut off. The media player automatically started the next video. It looked like it was night now, and she could hear her grandpa struggling for air as the camera whipped through some small branches. He then turned the camera towards the forest line and panned across it. The view then whipped to a different section of the woods. His breath began to slowly recover, still heavy but more level now. Her grandpa suddenly dropped the phone into the leaves. Emma leaned into the screen, trying to look at any details on the outside view. However, just as she was about to close the player, she was rocketed back by the abrupt sound of a gunshot exploding from the laptop speakers. After a few minutes of silence and heavy breathing, the cell phone was picked up from the leaves and the camera lens was pressed against the palm of her grandpa's hand. She could hear the sounds of leaves crunching under his feet and then the door opening. The cell phone was thrown on the table with the camera pointed towards the ceiling. Emma looked up and noticed it was the same ceiling. After a few moments, she saw her grandpa pick up the phone. His face was covered in sweat and he had a look of panic that Emma had never seen on him before. Without a word spoken, the footage suddenly stopped. Emma set down her coffee cup and restarted the video. This time she was continually pausing it, trying to find out what Grandpa was looking at in the woods. He must have got out his phone for a reason, right? After the second playthrough of the video, she spotted it. It was really faint, but it looked like 2 blue dots in the tree line of a single frame. Maybe animal eyes? Did they reflect blue when light was shined on them? Emma closed the video and opened the next one. It was security footage from the cabin. It was hours of nothing for the most part. As she skipped around the video, she found footage of a branch that blew in the wind that set off the motion capture, but nothing out of the ordinary. However, the nighttime footage was something completely different. Emma felt her heart rate accelerate as she watched the screen. A black mass dashed across each camera, stopping momentarily at a window or door before bolting away. It almost looked like it was trying to find a way inside. Emma could not tell if it had a form or shape. It would morph or melt into something new every few moments. What the hell, Emma whispered to herself. It had to have been a graphical glitch in the security system, or a bug crawling on the camera lens. But how did it move between each camera? She slowly closed the laptop and sat at the desk looking at the pile of books and papers. Emma took a moment to weigh her options. This certainly freaked her out, no question about that. She could leave tonight, sleep at a motel, and call her grandmother in the morning to let her know that she can't stay in the cabin. They could pull the whole family together and help her pack up the cabin in 1 or 2 days, power and numbers and all that stuff. But then Emma started to think about her financial situation. She would be homeless in a couple of weeks with what she had in the bank account. She really needed a few months to get things in order. She was being silly. She did not even know what she was scared of. Some weird video footage and a creepy note from her aging grandfather? Emma decided she'd sleep on it tonight and make up her mind in the morning. Pushing away from the desk, Emma grabbed the coffee cup and set it in the kitchen sink. She grabbed a throw blanket from the guest bedroom and cuddled up on the couch. It felt safer being by the door for some reason. She decided to leave the lamp on and the TV with the security footage. One night alone and I'm already going crazy, Emma thought to herself. The quiet night and the good bit of wine she had ingested slowly put her to sleep. Her eyelids felt heavy as she forced them open. Like sap draining from a tree, her mind slowly came to the realization of why she was awake. A knock at the door had dragged her out of unconsciousness and back into the cabin. Emma grabbed her phone off the table to check the time. The black screen of her phone lit up to reveal the time as 1:34 a.m. Well, one thing was certain. She was not going to open that door. As she stood up from the couch, Emma froze in place as 3 light knocks echoed through the cabin from the door. Emma slowly moved towards the side window and peeked out of the curtain. She set her phone down on the side table by her keys. Opening the door to a stranger in the woods was not happening, but maybe she could get a look at who decided to visit her at 1 in the morning. Slowly, she moved the curtain to the side. It took a moment for her eyes to adjust to the darkness. At the cabin door was a young boy, no more than 6 years old, shaking from the cold forest air. "What are you doing out here?" said Emma towards the window. The boy turned towards her and did not respond. He just stood at the door with tears rolling down his pale cheeks. Emma thought about it for a moment and realized the boy could be hypothermic from the cold. She moved towards the door and was preparing to unlock it, but something deep inside her told Emma to slow down. She looked up from the door and towards the TV screen. The security cameras did not show the boy, but a black mass moving and morphing between the door and the window. The same thing she saw in the security footage on her grandfather's laptop. She stepped back from the door while staring at the screen. Emma moved her gaze from the screen to the side window. The boy had his face pressed against it, looking inside. Instead of fear and tears, it was now an expression of rage that the young boy wore. His arms extended an impossible length compared to his height to touch the top of the window. A claw-like hand dragged down the window, making an unnatural whine that echoed through the dead silent night. "Go away," screamed Emma at the thing outside her window. The thing's face suddenly changed to a confused expression. It tilted its head a near 180-degree angle. "Go away," it mimicked in a perfect tone and pitch to her own. It kept repeating the words, like they had just come into existence when spoken. After a moment, it stopped repeating the phrase and turned back towards the door. Emma could see the doorknob turn back and forth. However, the multiple locks kept the barrier firmly in place. She jumped back as she felt the entire cabin shake from a thunderous blow to the door. She could swear she saw some of the wood frame crack from the hit. Her mind whirled with one thought now. It tried to lure me out, and now it's going to break down the door to get me. Emma instinctively ran from the living room to the guest room and locked the door. A plan began to slowly form in her adrenaline-swamped mind. Just as she was turning towards the window of the room, the cabin exploded with the sound of shattering glass. It got through the living room window, Emma thought to herself. Her hands worked quickly on unlocking and opening the guest room window. It was an old lock that had grown accustomed to the current position and resisted the sudden change. Emma pressed against it with all of her might and managed to unlock the window. However, as she pulled up to complete her escape, the window did not move from its position. In a panic, she checked the lock again, trying to quickly learn what was blocking it. Then she covered her mouth, fighting back the tears as she saw the issue. 2 large nails had been driven into the window to prevent it from opening. What was meant to protect the cabin was now trapping her inside. Emma heard the thing rampaging through the room beside the guest room. It was looking for her. She started searching the room for anything she could use as a tool, something that could help remove the nails. Most of it was trinkets and baubles that people end up collecting in the course of a long life. However, on the shelf was an old pocket knife that had been left and forgotten. Emma grabbed the knife and pulled the blade free. She started working on the edge of the nail head, slowly working it free from the wood. She managed to wedge the blade under the head and push down on the knife to use it like a lever to pull up the nail. The wooden frame made a slight groan as the first nail was removed. She then heard from behind her the doorknob turn and shake. Emma quickly started to work on the second nail. This one was driven a bit deeper into the wood, making it difficult to get the blade under the head of the nail. She worked feverishly to remove small splinters of wood away from the nail, stabbing and gouging the frame. "Come out. It's okay," said a familiar voice from behind the guest room door. Her mind raced as she tried to remember where she had heard this voice before. Emma did not respond, but instead continued to work on removing the nail from the window. "Come out and join me," said the voice firmer this time. Then the pieces fell together in one moment of remembrance. It was her grandfather's voice calling to her from behind the locked door. The knife's edge managed to slip under the second nail head. She pushed down to pull up the nail halfway up before it bent at a 45-degree angle. The nail was driven into the wood with a bend that made it difficult to remove with the knife. At this point, Emma decided that it was now or never. She was out of time. She pressed both arms against the frame of the window and pushed with every ounce of strength she could summon. The thing was now banging on the door, howling in a pitch and tone that changed every few seconds. The deafening screech motivated her to push even harder on the window. At last, it gave way with a splintering sound that cracked the frame. Without hesitation, Emma crawled through the window into the cold night air. The old nail, still lodged in the frame, dragged across her back, tearing her shirt and cutting into her flesh. She winced at the hot flame of pain, but continued forward. Something told Emma that this was nothing compared to what that thing in the house would do. Emma fell to the ground in a not-so-graceful manner. However, it only took a moment to get her feet on the ground and start running for the tree line. The cold night air burned her lungs as she took in ragged, deep breaths of air. She found a dense brush and dipped inside it, laying flat on the ground to try to make herself small. A blast of noise came from the cabin as the door gave way. The light from the window disappeared behind the shattering sound of the lamp. The thing crawled outside in one swift motion. Its form had become strange, with limbs spanning different lengths and sizes. It brought up its head and started to huff the air with a low growl between each intake of air. The thing's face no longer looked like a young boy, but a mesh of faces shifting between different characteristics. Somehow, without disturbing the leaves on the ground, the thing dashed from the broken window to the tree line behind the house, disappearing from sight. Seeing the speed and stealth of that thing made Emma realize that it could be on her before she knew it. The thought of a walk through the dark woods without a light source did not pass the sniff test. Burying her face in her hands, she realized she did not have her cell phone either, so she could not call for help, did not want to walk down the forest road, and the chill of the air was slowly settling into her core. She had been so busy trying to stay alive in those last few chaotic minutes, she did not realize her body was shaking. And what was hunting her now? Was it a person or an animal? This must have been the thing occupying the mounds her grandfather discovered, and it followed him back here. Maybe your grandfather did not die of a heart attack. She pushed away the question and unorganized thoughts. She could spend the rest of her life coming to terms with this night. Right now, she needed to focus on getting out of the woods. Emma decided the only course of action left was to go back into the cabin, grab her car keys and cell phone, then make her exit. She waited in the brush for an agonizing couple of minutes. Deciding it was clear, Emma stood up from her hiding spot and quickly sprinted towards the cabin door. The moon cast a shadow from every tree that threatened to have unknown horrors hidden within. Ancient monsters that humanity had forgotten to record, and the oral stories of them lost to time. Emma imagined all the possible ways she could be attacked in that short sprint to the door. However, the only sound that filled the frigid night was the crunch of autumn leaves. Arriving at the door, Emma remembered it was locked. However, she was not certain it would even open anymore since the iron screen door had been bashed in to the point of being unusable. She stepped across the shattered side window into the cabin, being careful not to cut her legs on any stray pieces of glass. The inside of the cabin looked like a small tornado had manifested at its center. The furniture and tables had been moved or knocked over, and the long claw marks now decorated many of the walls. Emma stepped carefully along the floor towards her tennis shoes. Most of the glass had been knocked clear of the window and scattered inside the living room. The last thing Emma needed was glass stuck in her bare feet. Slipping on her shoes, she started to sift through the wreckage for her cell phone and keys. The table holding them had been flung to the other side of the room, so she figured they could be anywhere now. The sound of grinding glass under her feet echoed through the silent cabin. As she extended her search, she at last spotted her cell phone under a broken chair. Emma pulled it free from the pile of wood and brought it up for a closer inspection. The screen looked like a spider web, and the power button did not bring the phone to life. Letting out an extended breath, she slipped the phone into her back pocket with a knife and continued looking for the keys. Walking down the hall, she spotted the splintered remains of the guest room door. The claw marks covering the door sent a shiver down her spine. Instinctively turning away from the sight, a new, more terrifying one quickly replaced it. Moving through the window was the mound creature. Its extended limbs stretched to cover the distance to the floor, while its head looked behind it towards the tree line. Emma covered her mouth and slipped into the main bedroom. She tried to slow her breath, to be quiet, but the spike of blood flow and adrenaline demanded more oxygen. Did it see me? Emma could not be sure, but she thought it would already be attacking her if it had. Escaping through a window would not be an option this time, since the bedroom only had a skylight ceiling. Emma took out her broken cell phone and pocket knife and set them on the nightstand table. Pressing the power button multiple times still had no effect on the phone. All Emma wanted to do was hide in this room and wait, but she knew this thing, creature, whatever it was not going to give up. Inaction would certainly end badly, she thought. Then she turned towards the gun safe beside the bed. Twisting the handle and pulling on the door, Emma hoped she had not locked it. The safe opened with a slight metallic sound as the heavy door swung open. Inside the safe was a few hunting rifles, a handgun, and a couple of shotguns. She had never fired a handgun or rifle, but her grandfather did take her to a gun range to shoot some clay targets. At the local range, you could rent guns for a small fee, which her grandfather enjoyed and would often force her to come along. His favorite was the shotguns, which happened to be the only gun she had ever fired. Picking it up from the safe, it felt heavy in her hands. She started to grab green shells from the box in the safe, sliding them into the gun. Slowly, her memory of those range practices were coming back to her. Taking another moment to inspect the shotgun, Emma remembered to turn off the safety. Summoning her courage to enter the hallway, she took in a few deep breaths. At the last moment, she turned around and put the small knife in her front pocket, which barely fit in her jeans. It felt like a good luck charm now. Emma entered the hallway and started moving towards the back door with the firearm in hand. Every step felt like it could be her last. Pushing away the fear, she focused on controlling her breathing and stepping lightly. Halfway down the corridor, she froze in place from the screeching scream behind her. Emma tried to will her muscles to move, to run, but all she could manage to do was turn towards the source of the noise. Charging towards her was the mound creature, expelling sounds and words with no form or context. Bringing up the gun, Emma pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. A sudden moment of clarity emerged from her mind. She had not chambered a round into the shotgun. Pumping the fore-end loaded the round, and she brought up the firearm again. However, the mound creature had already crossed the short distance and knocked the gun out of her hands. With its other free limb, it slammed it into Emma's chest, sending her flying into the wall. In an instant, it felt like the world had been turned upside down. Her head throbbed from hitting it against the hard surface, and her outer vision was dark and blurry. She tried to get her feet under her body, but Emma was unable to coordinate the movement and instead pushed her feet ineffectively against the floor, only sliding a few inches away from the approaching monster. The mound creature stood over Emma and let out a roar, not one of rage, but of victory, celebration for the coming feast. It bent down and wrapped its hands around Emma like iron coils, pinning her to the floor. The creature brought its face next to hers, and she suddenly felt a stabbing pain in her chest. A swirl of colors filled Emma's vision. It felt like her heart was exploding. An unfathomable cold gripped Emma's body. It was as if she had been dropped into a pond of freezing water. Emma reached for something, anything, what she assumed would be her last few moments before this thing absorbed her. Then she felt it in her pocket. With the last bit of strength Emma had left, she drove the pocket knife into the creature's chest. The mound creature seemed more annoyed than injured, but it released its grip for just a second. She kicked hard against the monster, sending herself a couple of feet down the hall. Crawling down the corridor, her body screamed with pain. Screeching, enraged at the disruption, the mound creature moved to trap its prey again. Emma screamed in response as she continued down the hall. It was on top of her in mere moments, ready to resume the ritual. But something made of iron was between it and the prey. The point-blank blast of the shotgun sent the creature bounding away. A black ooze trickled down the hall as it blindly slashed at the walls. Emma dropped the gun and got back on her feet, slowly walking towards the back door. She fell to one knee for a moment, desperately fighting to stay conscious. Her knee landed on something hard. Looking down, she saw her car keys. In one motion, she scooped them up and started moving towards the back door. As she exited the cabin, she got one more look at the thing in the hall. It was grabbing at its face, digging the buckshot out and roaring with pain. Emma hobbled to the car and collapsed into the driver's seat. The tires kicked up dirt as she floored it down the road. She could not see the creature, but she could hear its unearthly scream as it charged outside the cabin. Then she heard it speak. "I will find you again," screamed the mound creature in a symphony of voices. The car struggled to stay on the dirt road, going down the hill. Emma was taking the path far faster than she had done before. The vehicle often threatened to hit a tree, but she managed to keep the course. At last hitting the asphalt road, Emma felt the extent of her injuries. She was freezing cold, and she was pretty sure she had a concussion and broken ribs. The car managed to stay on the asphalt road a couple of more miles before slowly veering off into a ditch. Emma's head hitting the steering wheel was the last thing she remembered before the world went dark. When she came to, it was sunny outside, and a sheriff was opening her car door. She instinctively started to fight the hands that were grabbing her, pushing herself towards the passenger seat. The sheriff released her with a perplexed look hanging on his face. He appeared old and haggard, but seemed to be genuinely concerned. Whoa, settle down, you had a bad car wreck. We have an ambulance on the way," said the sheriff. Emma let go of his hands as her mind tried to catch up with the situation. Her eyes darted back and forth, looking for the creature, but the only sight was the sheriff SUV and the tree line. "The mound," Emma said. "The mound?" responded the sheriff, looking around the wreck. "Don't go to the mound. It's waiting for people there," responded Emma. Clark downed the last bit of water he had left in his bottle as the Anderson cell truck bounced down the dirt road. He noticed Rob was asleep in the passenger seat, with his cap pulled down over his head. As the new guy, Clark was expected to do most of the driving at the cell tower. Not by any company rule per se, it was just expected. I guess after doing the job for years, you get tired of all the driving, and you end up making the lowest guy on the totem pole do it. Well, that was fine by Clark. He preferred the drive anyways. It relaxed him, allowed him to work through his thoughts. This was his last week of training with Rob. Then he would be on a 4-man team. It'd be a lot of time on the road and an unending supply of towers to climb. The work was easy enough. It was mostly maintenance. Use a bit of spray paint on sections of the tower that had missing paint, replace light bulbs, tighten bolts, nothing too major. Every once in a while, he would install a new antenna or replace a transmission line, but that was okay by Clark. Variety was the spice of life, after all. The part of the job that demanded the higher pay was the fact that someone had to actually climb the tower. This is not a job for everyone. Can't be afraid of heights for starters, and it required you to be in pretty good shape. In Clark's downtime, he liked to do mountain climbing, so the heights and the fitness was not an issue for him. This was pretty much his dream job as far as he was concerned. As they approached the cell tower, Clark reached over and patted Rob on the shoulder. "Hey man, we're here." Rob pulled his cap up and let out a slight groan. It took a bit for him to respond, like he was stuck between wakefulness and sleeping. "Alright, let's get it done," responded Rob. The tower in front of them was one of the larger ones, over 200 feet off the ground. Clark parked the truck next to the fence and got out to stretch his legs. Rob made his way to the gate, fishing for a key in his pocket to unlock it. Taking his climbing gear out of the back of the truck, Clark started to get himself ready. He inspected his carabiners and rope for any possible damage. It takes a bit of time, but he figured it was better to get home later than to not get home at all. "Good habit. You should always double check your gear," said Rob. "I double check it when I rock climb. I figure this is no different." "Do you know how many times people fall off these towers?" said Rob with an eyebrow raised, fighting back a smile. Clark shook his head in confusion, not looking away from his task. "Well, one time seems to be enough for most people." He could not help but laugh a little at the joke. even if it was kinda dark. "Well, I plan on shooting for 0, responded Clark. "Well, that's a fine goal." Clark attached his harness to the main line and started climbing the tower. Rob gave him a big grin and 2 thumbs up from the ground. He was going to retire soon, so Rob seemed happy allowing the younger people to make the climbs. This was a simple job. Take a few pictures of its condition, replace one of the main bulbs at the top. He made his way up the structure in a methodical manner, taking the time to test his footholds before pushing off to the next spot. Clark used his legs to do the work. His arms just helped him stay balanced. Halfway up, Clark attached one of the carabiners on his harness to the handhold metal peg. He took a couple of pictures and sip of water before detaching and continuing the climb. It felt freeing being off the ground and ascending into the sky. The world literally disappeared as he made his way up. The only sound that filled his ears was his feet contacting the metal tower pegs and the rush of wind that pushed past him. Once he got to the top, he attached a safety line from his harness to the platform before detaching from the main cable. He opened the bulb canister and got to work replacing it. After he is satisfied with the work, he began the descent back down. He would have preferred to rappel with his gear, but Rob frowned on that last time. He informed Clark that rappelling gear was for emergencies only. Even though he had to climb all the way back down, he still made pretty good time. He never rushed, he just kept an even pace from beginning to end. "You know, you don't get a bonus for finishing fast," said Rob as soon as Clark's foot touched the ground. "I thought we could knock out 2 towers today. Saw they wanted us to do a maintenance check on the Greer Tower." The color drained from Rob's face at those words, like he had just invoked a dangerous curse that could smite them at any moment. "No, we're gonna skip the Greer Tower. It's coming down in a couple of months anyways." "Work order says." "Well, the work order does not make the damn decisions," said Rob, cutting off Clark before he could get started. He knew better than to press the issue right now. Rob was a nice guy, but when his mind was made up, you could not change it in the heat of the moment. Clark and Rob loaded up the gear without a word and locked the gate. Both of them got into the truck and started down the long dirt road back to town. After an awkward 10 minutes, Clark determined now was a good time to break the silence. "Can I ask you just one question?" "Sure, why not?" "The Greer Tower is like 80-ish feet tall. We could knock it out in no time. Why are you so against us going to it? We skipped it on my first week, too." Rob removed his cap and rubbed his head like the question was some dirt stuck in his hair. After a short pause, he put his cap back on and let out an exhausted sigh. "Look, I know you're going to think I'm some superstitious old fool, but that tower isn't right." "Isn't right how?" asked Clark, a bit more intrigued now. "The management team acts like it's not a problem, but all of us that have been around for a while know that the Greer Tower is not safe. Some accidents have happened there." "Hard to climb?" "Well, no, it's an easy climb, but a few people just seem to fall off it. But that's not the weirdest part. Some people climb it and never come back down." The words sent a shiver down Clark's spine. He could tell by Rob's tone that he was not joking this time. "What happens to them?" Rob considered the question for a moment, then shrugged. "Don't know. They just never show back up, and corporate assumes they abandoned the job. Apparently, about 500,000 people go missing every year in the US, according to Google. I think that's why they're going to decommission the tower, though. Too much of a headache to get people to maintenance it." "And people are okay with that explanation?" asked Clark. "In the past, the unknown was the edge of the world. The new edge of the world in the modern age is lost in people's inability to admit that they don't know." Clark left the conversation hanging in the air without a response, and Rob seemed fine not talking about it. The rest of the drive into town was silent, with Rob looking out the window and Clark focused on the road. The work truck pulled into the parking lot next to Rob's car. Rob gave him a nod and exited the vehicle. "See you tomorrow, bud." said Rob with a wave. Clark waved back and put the truck into drive, exiting the parking lot. He could not help but think about the strange conversation. Clark did not believe in things he could not see. His dad used to tell him, anything that can't be tested or verified is unworthy of study. The world made sense when you got right down to it. Clark made a U-turn halfway down the empty road and started heading towards the Greer Tower. He plugged in the coordinates onto his phone's GPS with one hand and the other hand on the steering wheel. Rob is spooked by it, but this work order is calling for a maintenance check on that tower, and he intended to do it. Although he respected the hell out of Rob, at the end of the day, he was not management, they were peers. If corporate caught wind of the fact that they had falsely said they had completed the work, they could both lose their jobs. If anything, he was doing Rob a favor. Clark had never climbed a tower by himself, but he had lots of experience at this point. He had pretty much completed his training program with Rob as his mentor. Plus, this was a small cell tower. He would have it done in no time, and he could turn in the work order in the morning. The GPS voice broke his thoughts as it informed him it was time to turn left. The gravel road kicked up bits of rock as the tires gained traction on the ground. In the distance, he could see the cell tower hanging just above the tree line. The steel structure stood in contrast to the natural green of the scene. Even the sky around it appeared to be corrupted by the tower's presence, the blue turning a darker shade of gray. Pulling up to the tower, Clark was surprised to see a tall tree to the right of the structure. He assumed they would have cut down that tree before putting up the tower. The branches of the tree still had a 10-foot clearance, so it would be okay. Clark exited the truck and pulled his climbing gear out of the back. He inspected it for any defects, just like he had done numerous times before. Once he was sure everything was in proper order, he put on his harness, grabbed his gear, and attached to the main cable running down the cell tower. Glancing down at his feet, Clark spotted something that made little sense. Stones had been pressed into the ground around the structure, making a circular path. Each one had a strange symbol carved into its center, a form and language foreign or forgotten to the records of humanity. Although under any normal circumstance this would have given him reason to pause, it simply did not fit in with his current goal. Ignoring the stones, Clark began the climb up the structure. He found that the tower was relatively easy to climb. The metal pegs alternated between the left and right of the beam at even spacing. Essentially, this was the same as climbing a ladder. The structure was actually in pretty good shape. After hearing Rob's warning, he would have assumed that other crews had also neglected the maintenance. He snapped a couple of pictures halfway up and took a large gulp from his water bottle before continuing the climb. Just as he got above the tree line, his hands instinctively latched on the metal pegs. Clark had that weird feeling in his stomach, like he had just taken a drop off the roller coaster. His mind had assumed he was falling, but as far as he could tell, everything was normal. "What the hell?" said Clark under his breath. His voice echoed in the quiet, stale air. Then it dawned on him how silent everything had become on the tower. The wind had stopped, the sky was dark, and he could no longer see the ground. His mind worked hard trying to come up with an explanation for his current observation. He settled on a storm blowing in quickly. The simplest explanation is normally the best. Clark made the decision now was a good time to use his rappelling gear to get back down quickly. Lightning could be extremely dangerous for anyone working on a cell tower, and he had no one else out here who could call for help. Once he was certain the gear was ready, Clark detached from the main cable and began his descent back to the ground. A low sound bellowed through the air. A hum from some unknown source filled his ears. It did not sound electrical in nature, but almost had a melody, a method to its course. Then his descent stopped as he reached the end of the rappelling line. Clark hung from the rope, baffled by his current predicament. The rappelling gear should have been more than enough cord to get him to the bottom. Yet, he found himself still hanging from the tower. He winced as something flew past his head. He only got a brief glimpse at it, but it had a blue and white color. Clark used his legs to swing himself back to the main tower cable, reattaching to the main line and detaching from the rappelling gear. Looking down, Clark was still unable to see the ground. However, his eyes picked up on a bit of movement. The blackness that filled his vision rippled like a stone dropped into a pond. Clark shut his eyes for a moment and looked back at the darkness. It must have been an optical illusion, his mind playing tricks on him. Recovering his rappelling gear, Clark began the climb down. He figured he must be pretty close to the ground. Each time his foot hit one of the metal pegs, a metallic ring echoed through the air. It gave him the sensation of being in a cave that unsettled him. Each sound he made felt unnaturally loud. Slowly, his mind was coming to terms with the new reality that he had to admit. Something was very wrong with the Greer Tower. After an hour, he decided it was time to take a break. Clark attached 2 carabiners with a safety line from his harness to the structure. His legs had a dull ache from the climbing he had just done. They desperately needed rest, so he allowed himself to hang off the beams. Scratched into the pole were the initials JGH. Normally, he would have covered it up with some spray paint, but he was past doing his job at this point. Now that he was no longer engaged in a task, he had no choice but to think about the current predicament. The rappelling gear alone should have been enough to get him back to the ground. Along with climbing down, he should have easily tripled the distance from the top of the tower. Taking out his water bottle, he took a long drink from it. A blue and white object fell past him, causing him to let go of his water bottle and grab for a metal peg. He watched his water bottle descend into the blackness below. "What keeps falling off this piece of shit tower?" yelled Clark. Then he heard his voice echo, but not just around him. It took a moment for it to happen, but he could hear his muffled voice come from below him as well. That was it. He may look like a fool, but he was calling it. He got out his cell phone and concluded it was time to call for a rescue. He needed help. When he attempted to make the call, it was dropped. Looking at his phone, he noticed he had no signal. He switched to his emergency walkie and made a request for a rescue. He waited, hanging from the tower for a response, but none came. He repeated the request multiple times, but his only answer was static from the handheld talkie. Then he heard it pick up a response, but it was not the one Clark had hoped for.
"Can't move,"
came a distorted voice from the walkie. Clark turned off his walkie and hung from the structure. For the first time since he was a kid, he literally had no idea what to do now. Rescue was not coming. He could not get off the tower, and he was in a situation that did not fit into Clark's worldview. Then he felt the insidious sting of dread wash over him, the kind of primal fear felt by animals stuck in a cage. This was the type of emotion that truly tested what was in an individual's core. Would he press forward or crumble? He shook off the fear and doubt. He had to focus on what he knew. The rules of the world have changed, and now he needed to adapt to that quickly or never leave like the other people who disappeared on this tower. God, he was such a fool for not listening to Rob. "If I get back, I owe you a big apology, buddy." Detaching his carabiners, he continued to climb down the tower. He was not sure how climbing down would help, but he honestly did not have a better idea right now. After 30 minutes of what appeared to be little progress, he decided to stop. He did not want to waste any more energy on a pointless activity. Hanging from the tower, he forced his tired mind to focus on the problem. As far as Clark could tell, the ground and sky did not exist anymore. That was an unsettling thought. It did not even feel like he was outside, but rather like he was in a cave or a long tunnel. So if he was not outside, where was he then? Maybe he had completely lost his mind. That was an option. Or maybe he died on the tower and now he's stuck in some kind of purgatory. The fact that his muscles ached felt like a pretty good indication that he was alive. One time, when he was stuck in a motel room, he watched a documentary about fringe science and the possibility of alternate universes. Perhaps he was stuck in a different dimension. Clark saw a blue and white object fall past him and descend into the black veil below. Peering into the dark, something struck his shoulder, causing him to let go of the handholds on the metal pegs, and he began to fall. He fell a couple of inches before the main cable he was attached to stopped his plunge. His breathing was heavy now. It took a concentrated effort to swallow and put his heart back into his chest. Looking up, Clark could see the object that struck him was now stuck in between two bars. It was a nearly empty water bottle. But not just any water bottle. It was his water bottle that he had dropped before. Reaching up to grab the bottle, he brought it near his face for a closer inspection. The part of the label he had picked at nervously was missing from the container. Putting the bottle back on his belt, an idea began to fall together. Clark reattached his safety line from his harness to the tower and allowed himself to hang from it. He then got out his phone and set a stopwatch feature. Closing his eyes, he tried to rest. He needed to allow his heart rate to decrease. Hanging from the tower for so long without any movement felt surreal, like he was in a dream and he was going to wake up any moment. Clark half expected to be back in his bed when he opened his eyes, but instead he found himself still hanging from the tower. Once his cell phone timer hit 45 minutes, he stopped it and turned off his phone. He figured it'd be smart to save battery power. Taking off his tool bag, he opened it as wide as possible. He leaned to the left and held out the bag where he thought would be the best position. Awkwardly holding the bag suspended from the structure would look moronic to anyone on the ground. Good thing no one was here, no ground to watch from, he thought to himself. His arms began to shake from holding the position, but he had to stay in place. This was the only idea he had right now. After a few minutes, a blue and white object fell from above Clark and hit his arm, landing into the tool bag. He brought himself back against the tower and hung the bag from one of the metal pegs. Fishing inside, he brought up a blue and white notepad with a rubber band wrapped around it. So his theory was right. This was the mystery object that kept passing by him. After finding his water bottle, he figured other objects could also fall and loop back around, which means this place works like a Pac-Man screen. That would explain why he could not find the top or bottom of this tower. He pulled off the rubber band to open the notepad. The band crumbled apart from the pressure. It had lost its elasticity long ago. Looking inside, it appeared to be notes from different work orders on cell towers. However, halfway through the notepad, he saw the context of the writing had changed. The writing looked to be hastily written journal entries. Clark flipped a few pages back to the first entry. Hanging from the tower, he began to read the entries in the notepad. Entry 1. I think it has been about a day at this point. I forgot my watch on the nightstand, and my phone died a few hours ago. I didn't have any cell signal, and my phone drained the battery looking for one. I can't get off this tower. I don't see the ground, and I can't see the top. I spent the entire day climbing down and never reached the bottom. It's like I'm not making any progress. I wanted some kind of record of whatever it is that's happening. I'm going to get a little rest and keep climbing. Well, I guess whoever wrote this got stuck too, Clark thought to himself. He flipped to the next page to read another entry. Entry 2. Kept climbing down, still no bottom. I'm out of water now and getting pretty thirsty. I'd hoped I would either find the ground or someone would come up and get me by this point. I know this does not make any sense, but I don't think I'm on the same tower. I'm surrounded by darkness. This is grim, but I scratched my initials into the tower. Going to start climbing up instead. See if I can get above whatever this thing is. In case I don't get back, I want some kind of record I was here. Looking down at his nearly empty bottle, Clark realized he would soon be in the same boat. Flipping to the next page, it said, "Still no top." That message left him feeling uncomfortable. like he was getting a peek into someone's greatest moment of despair. However, the last entry chilled Clark to his core. Final entry. I kept climbing up and I did not find the top. Instead, I found my initials scratched into the damn pole in front of me. Somehow I came all the way around. This place is a circle folded in on itself. I can feel it, watching me. Just beyond my vision, something is there, waiting for me to slip. Sometimes it hums when I stop. Sometimes it tries to talk. Up and down is no good, but I got one option left. I'm leaving this notepad here as some kind of record. If anyone finds this, tell my kids that I love them more than anything in the world. Tell my wife I did everything I could to get back to her. That I know I messed up sometimes, but my heart was always hers. I love you. I'll be with you again. Javier Garcia Hernandez. Clark flipped back to the beginning of the entries and reread them. He hoped for a different answer, but no matter how many times he read them, he came up with the same revelation. That Javier's fate was most likely his future. No, he was not staying here. Clark put the notepad into his pocket. He reattached the rappelling gear and made his way down. Again, he found himself hanging at the bottom of the rope, with no end in sight. Just an endless expanse of black that filled his vision. And the little light that came through the void was getting darker. He repeated the process multiple times. He must have rappelled down 800 feet before giving up. He attached his 2 safety lines to the main structure and hung from them, defeated by the unending expanse. Well, if he had any doubt before, that was firmly put to rest now. He half debated trying to climb up instead, but he needed to stop. Plus, climbing up did not seem to do Javier any good. He wedged himself on the metal beams and tried to get comfortable. He went ahead and attached a safety line just in case. Resting felt like giving up, but at this point he was out of ideas. Resting was the best option. Sitting on the tower, he was engulfed by the feeling of loneliness. He had always been a loner, but he would see neighbors or engage in small talk with coworkers. Just being around other people felt comforting. But this was what true isolation felt like. It was void of those comforts, of that safety we take for granted. No one was here. No one was coming. Sitting in the darkness, time felt like it would not pass. He could hardly tell if it had been minutes or hours. However, at some point, he closed his eyes and dozed off. Clark's foot falling off the metal beam got him awake again. Waking up confused and disoriented, he looked around trying to make sense of his surroundings. It was dark, but the movement around him made no sense. Then he felt a tug on his foot and looked down. A thin hand was pulling at his foot. Its pale skin almost seemed to glow with a translucent appearance. Multiple hands manifested themselves from the void, grabbing him, pulling at him. The limbs stretched from impossibly long distances to find him. Letting out a panicked scream, Clark thrashed and fought with the hands grabbing him, kicking and desperately trying to find a way to escape. However, Clark's movement caused him to tip to the side, sending him off the edge of the narrow beam. The sudden plunge made him draw in his breath, to somehow extend his last few moments. But the single safety line he had attached to the beam grabbed his harness and prevented the eternal fall. The force of the stopped fall knocked the air out of his lungs. It hurt like hell, being unable to move for a minute. The hands slowly withdrew from the beam, slithering back to their imperceptible hiding places. Clark managed to grab the safety line and pull himself back up to the beam. A low hum echoed through the dark dimension. He was nearly certain it was whatever was trying to grab him. Clark reattached himself to the main cable and drank the last bit of water. The bottle shook in his hands from the sudden spike of adrenaline that flooded his system. He started climbing down the tower, even though he knew it would not make a difference, but he wanted to get himself a bit of distance from the spot of that ambush. This felt like the safe choice, but a thought still clawed in his mind. What if it can appear from anywhere in this place? He was accustomed to long climbs, but he wondered how long he'd be able to keep this up. He doubted he'd be getting any sleep in this place going forward. Then the dull pain of his muscles revealed the truth of what was happening. That was the point. It wanted to keep him moving, keep him tired. The hands that grabbed him were certainly unsettling, but they did not appear to have any real strength behind their pull. It was a temperature check for its meal. Once it decided I was not ready, they retracted back. All it has to do is wait for me to become too tired to fight back. Javier knew about the entity in the shadows, but didn't he say he had another option? Up and down is no good. That is what he said, but what is the third option? Clark looked to his right and saw only a black veil. Rob said some people never come back off this tower, but he also said some people fall off it. If people fall off it, then it must be possible to get back. Grabbing a small flashlight out of his tool bag, he clicked on the power button. The LED bulbs came to life, displacing the darkness around him. He hoped this would reveal something and not just be a waste of a flashlight. Clark brought the light over his shoulder and threw it to his right. The flashlight flipped end over end away from the tower. However, after reaching 10 feet out, it vanished. Clark was baffled. It did not fall or get out of sight. It appeared to actually vanish from sight, like it was thrown out of existence. The third option is to jump horizontally off the tower. But was that really an option, or just a quicker exit to death? Even if it got him back, would he just be back in his world falling off a tower? If he exited from the same height he entered this place, and that was a big if, it'd be a 50-ish foot drop to the ground. That would likely be fatal, however it was a better shot than he had here. But being honest with himself, he had to admit he did not exactly know the rules involved with slipping between dimensions. For all he knew, it could kill him instantly, or he could fall from 1,000 feet up. He needed a little more information before committing to this plan. Clark climbed back up the beam he was resting on before. Although this was the last place he wanted to be, it got him closer to the edge of the veil. He could either attempt to exit left or right. What side was it on when he started climbing the tower? He thought it was on the right side, but he could not remember for sure. Clark settled on going with his gut and picked the right side. Detaching from the main cable, Clark used one of his safety lines and attached it to the narrow beam. At the end of the right side was a small antenna that needed to be removed first. He got to the edge of the beam and worked feverishly to complete the task. Once it was detached from the beam, he tossed it through the veil. He suspected he would need as much space as possible. Getting his phone out of his pocket, Clark held in the power button to turn it back on. Taking a roll of electrical tape, he wrapped the outer edges of his phone to a knot on the end of one of his backup ropes. He would have preferred duct tape, but electrical tape was all he had in his bag. Giving his phone a tug, it seemed to hold the rope. Walking to the edge of the beam, Clark opened his phone apps and set the camera to record. The beam groaned from the excess weight at the end of it, but it held. He tossed his phone through the veil with one hand, holding the rope with the other. The phone vanished from sight for a moment before being dragged back through the veil. Now he could mark interdimensional fishing off his bucket list. Pulling the phone back up, he stopped the recording and examined the footage. He saw the phone go through something, then suddenly a burst of light before going dark. Other than the change in light, he could not make out any other details. But this was a good sign. It meant the veil did go somewhere. However, he wanted to know what he would land on when he came out. Clark repeated the process and threw the phone through the veil, but he did so with a bit more force this time. The phone disappeared and he pulled the rope to bring it back. Clark could instantly tell the weight was off and a feeling of dread crept inside him. Pulling up the end of the rope, his fears had been confirmed. A ball of electrical tape hung from the knot, absent of the phone. Clark's mind began to prepare a flurry of curses to precede his bad fortune, but it was cut short. A screech echoed through the unending dimension that suffocated any other notion. Then one thought managed to surface above the rest. It knows I'm trying to escape, and it's coming for me now. Descending down the tower was a multitude of hands and body parts. The creature quickly approaching him appeared to be made of many corpses, borrowed parts to make up its form. Then he spotted the Anderson Cell logo attached to one of the many shoulders. Its victims become part of it. Clark had no intention of figuring out exactly how that process worked. He prepared to make the jump, moving down the beam. Nearing the edge, he felt the safety cable pull against his harness. He needed to detach from the safety line if he was going to jump. He worked feverishly to unlock the carabiner attached to him. However, he had never attempted to do it quickly, and his hands fumbled over the locking mechanism. The abomination used its many limbs to descend quickly down the tower and close the distance between it and Clark. It grabbed the line attached to Clark and dragged him away from the edge. He pulled with all of his strength, desperate to get away from it, but he was simply overmatched. Clark saw the multitude of hands and legs open like a fan, preparing to embrace him, to wrap him like a cocoon.
Join us. Never leave, never lonely,
said the creature. The other heads attached to its mass echoed the phrase. The arms clawed at his legs, letting go of the rope and pulling on him now. Clark grabbed the beam, doing anything he could to prevent the inevitable end. The beam began to bend from the weight and strain. It made one last groaning protest before snapping in the middle. The creature and Clark both plunged into the blackness below. The safety line attached to Clark's harness abruptly stopped the fall. He felt discombobulated from the sudden change, but forced his mind to work on the problem. Looking down, he could see the creature had managed to grab the tower and was working on getting back up to him. He grabbed his line and started climbing back up to the half beam. His arms worked with every bit of strength he had left. Clark knew this would be his last chance to get it right. Echoing behind him was the thud of limbs climbing to the tower, a drum-like melody that increased in speed and volume every few moments. Scrambling to the top of the beam, Clark detached the safety line from the harness. He could hear the monstrous cry just behind him, just within reach. The creature screeched,
"Don't go!"
Without hesitation, Clark ran to the end of the beam and jumped through the veil. It felt like he had just plunged into water. The sound of the world became muffled, and his vision could not comprehend the images that he was seeing. He could swear he even saw other people in this realm with him. An old man and someone else passed by him as he exited the other side of the veil. The world was bright again, and he was falling. Clark felt the wind rush past him as he plunged off the tower and back to the ground. He landed in a tall tree to the right of the structure, a tree that he remembered had no business being so near a cell tower. A flurry of tree limbs whipped past him, slowing his fall but leaving deep lacerations on his body. Finally hitting a branch that could hold his weight, the fall stopped. He pressed against the tree and wedged himself between the two branches he had landed on. Trying to move his right arm sent waves of pain that he could barely tolerate. Coming to this realization of his injuries, he was in no condition to climb down the tree. He used his left arm to radio for an emergency rescue that responded right away. He answered questions about his situation, condition, and the fact that he was now stuck in a tree. Although he was not out of the woods yet, he could not help but let his mind wander back to his conversation with Rob. Over 500,000 people go missing every year. How many of those people stumble into the unknown? They walk into a closet to slip into another world by accident, or come across some forgotten creature in the woods. Clark was thankful to be alive, but his eyes had now been opened to a new world, a more dangerous one, just beyond the reach of our own. Parking the van next to the tunnel, Chris got out to stretch his legs. The Alaskan night air felt bitterly cold on his face, even in the spring. However, it was a welcomed improvement from the cramped confines of the van. Chris got out his lighter and lit a cigarette. He tried to avoid smoking in the van as much as possible. Linda and Troy jumped out of the back, clearly just as eager to get some fresh air. When they traveled, Chris preferred to drive, even if making the trip to Alaska was the most brutal road trip he had experienced. It took over 50 hours to get to this place. He really hoped Troy was right about the footage that they would get here. The three of them started a scary video blog a couple of years back. They would travel to haunted houses, cursed hotels, or any destination that was just unnerving to the average person. He really didn't believe in the paranormal. He just wanted an excuse to get out of his small town. Plus, he could see this video blog turning into a real business. They were starting to get some traction online. Chris felt they were on the verge of something big. They just needed a really scary, unheard of place to push them over the top. According to Troy, that place was the town of Bear River. Troy found a map from '82 that showed the location of the town. Yet when you check next year's map, the town of Bear River is missing. Linda suggested it was a paper town, one of those fake towns created on a map to catch anyone who copied it. After all the digital census records didn't have any information on Bear River. Troy, however, was not convinced. He remembered hearing about the town as a kid, that some kind of accident caused them to evacuate the area. When he checked the paper census records, he found that Bear River had a population of over 500 people. But that one record was the only real proof the town existed. It was like the rest of the world was trying to pretend Bear River didn't exist. "So this tunnel goes into town?" asked Chris, getting out his flashlight from the van. Troy unfolded the map and turned on his GoPro. "Yep, looks like it's the only road into this place," said Troy. Linda picked up a sign that was on the ground and proudly displayed it to the camera. "I hope they don't shoot us," chuckled Linda. The sign was faded, but you could still read the message. "Property of the U.S. government, no trespassing." Scanning his light into the tunnel, Chris could tell the van was not an option. Inside the tunnel were multiple concrete barriers to prevent any traffic from entering Bear River. "A lot of barriers on the road. Looks like we're walking in. How far away is this town anyways?" asked Chris. Linda went over to Troy to help him look at the map. After a back and forth debate on how to read it, Linda came back with a quarter mile. They came too far to turn back now. It was decided they would leave the van and walk in. Preparing the bags turned out to be a difficult task. The ones they brought were not designed to hold a lot of gear for longer hikes, so they had to prioritize what they'd be bringing with them. They grabbed a few cameras, headlamps, backup batteries, audio equipment, and they each packed a bottle of water. Troy also insisted they bring a couple of hunting rifles on this trip. He borrowed them from his dad, who was a big hunter. The only problem being that none of them really did a lot of shooting. Sure, they grew up in an area where gun ownership was common, but they never got extremely interested in the activity. He thought an abandoned town may have wild animals that made it their home. Troy was the designated camera guru of the group, so he handed the rifles to Chris and Linda. Turning on the headlamps and camera, the three of them walked into the dark tunnel. It was even colder than the outside world, with bits of ice hanging from the ceiling. The area must have only received minimal traffic, since the road was a single lane, with just enough room to pull off to the side. It was clear they had been the first people to travel through this tunnel in some time. Along with concrete barriers, a couple of rusted-out vehicles had been left inside, the elements and time slowly converting them back into dust. Just as they were about to emerge on the other side of the tunnel, a thunderous sound echoed along the walls. Heading straight towards them was a mass of fur and muscle. Everyone instinctively tried to back away from the charging creature, but its speed outmatched their attempt to create any distance. Dropping his pack, Chris was the first person to bring up his rifle. He made a hasty shot that went wide, failing to find its target. The explosion of noise in the tunnel was a shock to Linda's system. It took everything she had to focus on the task at hand. She brought up the rifle and shot at the brown blur. Her round struck the side of the creature, slowing it just a bit. This gave Chris just enough time to chamber another round. Now it was mere feet away from him. If this shot failed, he'd be overtaken in moments. The tunnel exploded with the sound of a third shot being fired, this time finding its mark and hitting the creature's center mass. The force of the impact slowed the bear and caused it to take a couple of awkward steps before falling on its side. A few labored breaths could be heard escaping its bloody snout before stopping completely. Linda and Chris exchanged a glance, each silently thanking the other and acknowledging how close they just came to being mauled. The overwhelming panic was slowly turning into dull uneasiness now. Everyone's ears were ringing from the amplified noise of the gunshots. It caused the group to remain silent while the deafening effects passed. The first person to speak was Troy, who could only think of one thing to say. Holy shit, did that really happen? Chris had to ask the question he really wanted to know, even if it felt a bit awkward after a near-death experience. Did you catch that on camera? Hell yeah, well, at least on the GoPro for sure. Linda looked down at her hands and noticed they were still shaking from the adrenaline spike. She shook her hands to try to ignore it. Now that she was looking at the bear, something seemed strange about it. Then Linda spotted it. Hey, it got attacked by something else. Chris and Troy moved over to the carcass to examine Linda's discovery. The dead bear had small slash marks covering its body. Blood leaked from the wounds, indicating that they were fresh. Guess it got in a fight with another animal before it attacked us, theorized Troy. I think we should leave, said Linda. This idea threw Troy into a panic. Leave? We just got here. We need the footage. I don't think the bear wanted to attack us. I think it was running from something else. Linda took a couple of steps towards the exit of the tunnel, scanning the outside area. The idea that something far worse than a bear could be lurking outside filled the group with dread. Troy broke the uncomfortable silence. If we go back, we could be missing our chance at the best video yet. Chris took a moment to consider his next words. He knew Linda was right, that they really should leave. And he guessed you had to report a bear attack to the police or rangers or something. But what if this was the moment that decided whether their little venture would become more than just a hobby? Was he ready to leave that opportunity on the table? Let's go a bit further. If we see anything else off, we head back to the van. It'd be a wasted trip to not at least see if the town is here. Once we check it out, we head back and report the bear attack to the authorities, said Chris. Linda obviously didn't agree with the decision, but she did respect the voting process of the group. Fine, but if we get attacked by another bear, I'm letting it eat the two of you, replied Linda. This broke the tension in the air and caused everyone to let out a slight chuckle. A small escape from the fear they all felt, but could not explain in the moment. The three of them exited the tunnel and walked up the broken asphalt road. Everyone's eyes were now scanning the outside world, aware that real danger may live here. Once they got to the top of the slope, they saw the town of Bear River, or at least what was left of it. Most of the houses appeared to have collapsed over time, and only a few buildings in the town center were left standing. The strangest part of the scene was the number of vehicles. It was as if everyone had left without taking anything with them. Time and weather had worked diligently to slowly reclaim the town. The decay took hold quicker here than anywhere else in the States. The sign at the top of the slope had the faded message, "Welcome to Bear River." But just under it, someone carved a single word into the wooden sign. Croatoan. Something about it unnerved Chris, like it was a warning to anyone entering the town. But he felt like he had to be brave in front of his friends. If he suggested they leave now, he'd never hear the end of it. Whoa, just like the colony of Roanoke. That is some creepy stuff, said Troy. He got out his camera and started taking pictures of it, documenting the scene. What does Croatoan mean? Asked Linda. Troy stopped taking pictures to consider the question for a moment. Well, it was a tribe of Native Americans for sure, but the first American colony of Roanoke was a failed venture. All the inhabitants disappeared. The only trace of them was the word carved into a tree. Most historians think they either left with the Croatoan people or they got attacked by them. No one really knows, sort of a history mystery kind of thing. I'm sure someone left it here just to mess with people. The Croatoan Indians are on the east side of North America. We are about as far away as you can be from the original site. Chris traced his hand across the carving before joining the conversation. Maybe Croatoan is the name of the tribe and something else. Either way, it makes for good content. Guess we should head in and take pictures of the town now, said Troy. Linda didn't object out loud, but her facial expression clearly showed that she had some concerns. However, the group packed up their things and went deeper into Bear River. Walking into an abandoned town felt like visiting a sacred spot. Something about a place that used to facilitate daily lives of people deserves some kind of reverence, not just for the faded hopes and dreams of its people, but for the opportunity it once represented. It felt like visiting a funeral of someone who died young. The unknown that is lost, the potential of what could have been hung in the air. The downtown area was a small strip of buildings, with a single road going through the town. Most of the windows were broken and the walls looked like they could be pushed over with enough force. Looking into the buildings revealed artifacts from the 80s. Old VCRs, TVs that had bulging screens, and a few cassette tapes could be found littering the shop. It was like journeying through a busted time capsule. As they got near the end of the road, Linda was the first person to spot them. Standing on top of one of the buildings was a person overlooking the road. It was too dark to see them clearly. Only the silhouette was visible in the moonlight. "What is that guy doing up there?" whispered Linda as she pointed up. "Well, let's ask him," said Troy, clearly unconcerned with drawing attention to them. Before anyone could interject, he shouted, "Hey man, are you scouting this place too?" "You idiot," growled Chris. "You know we're trespassing, right?" The figure on top of the building didn't respond with words, but instead with a call.
Grow.
The strange creature disappeared from sight, as if that one response was all that was needed. Then a sound filled the night air that made them all understand their mistake. An uproar of monstrous calls could be heard from all direction, answering the first. No words were needed to explain the course of action. All three of them ran away from the building, certain that whatever answered the howl was coming for them now. Chris diverted his path and sprinted towards a relatively intact building. Throwing his shoulder into the door, he managed to force it open. "Over here," shouted Chris, motioning for his friends to follow him. Troy and Linda rushed past him and slammed the door shut. "Turn off your lights," whispered Linda. They quickly powered off their headlamps. Then the three of them stood in the dark, taking in deep breaths, trying to remain as quiet as possible. Outside the broken window, they saw a group of people run past them, heading in the direction they had just been moments ago. But something about the people appeared off. Their limbs were too long for their bodies. It looked like something out of a cartoon, not real life. Yet these things appeared to really exist, and they were hunting them now. Once the sound of the footsteps disappeared, Linda whispered, "Should we try to head back now?" "Maybe. Troy, did you bring any ammo with you for these rifles?" "I figured the rounds in the guns would be enough," replied Troy. "How many rounds do each rifle hold?" "I think 3, which was not the news Chris wanted to hear. Checking his rifle confirmed what they feared. He had 1 single bullet, which meant Linda's rifle had 2. They could not afford to have direct conflict with whatever those things were. They would be outmatched quickly with only 3 shots. "I think we should hold up here for a bit," said Chris. "Well, we should at least look around and see if we can find anything useful," suggested Troy. Turning on a small pocket flashlight, they started to explore the building. They kept close together, all staying near the only source of light they had now. The headlamps were too bright to risk turning on. But now they had a chance to examine the area. They could see it was a sheriff's office. It had a couple of desks, a single jail cell, and an empty gun case. Someone must have looted the firearms a while back. "Can you bring the light over here?" asked Linda. She was staring at a single sheet of paper and a typewriter. It was a miracle that it was still intact. They all gathered around the typewriter to read the last record. I don't know if anyone will find this, but the military won't let us leave. Instead of helping us, they're just going to quarantine the whole damn town and let us die. Your tax dollars at work, I guess. In case this doesn't work out, I want to leave some kind of record. The native Alaskans used to warn us that we settled too near the mountains, that a bad shaman from far away hibernated in the caves. They called him the Sleepy Giant. At the time, I just assumed it was some kind of superstitious story. I wish we had listened to them. That thing came down the mountains one night and started slaughtering us. It took a shotgun blast like it was nothing. But the worst part is it started bringing back the people it killed to help it. One moment we're fighting a giant, next we're fighting our friends and family in the streets. I don't know how many of us are left, but I'm taking the guns and anyone I can find who's still normal, and we're going to get the hell out of here. Everyone stood silently around the typewriter, all wondering the same question. Did they make it out of town? Which led to the next and most important question of all. Would they be able to escape Bear River? Troy had the idea to start searching the desks for any supplies. The last desk in the corner had a .38 revolver, a small box of ammo, and a bottle of vodka. Troy, Linda, and Chris passed the bottle around and each took a swig. It burned like fire going down, but it made them feel a bit warmer in the cold building. Chris loaded the revolver and inspected the ammo before pocketing the rest of the box. "Does ammo go bad?" "I don't think so," replied Linda with a bit of uncertainty in her voice. "Well, want the rifle or the revolver?" asked Chris. "Guess I'm going with the rifle," replied Troy. "If I miss, I can use it like a club." One final idea came to mind. Chris used his knife to cut off a bit of fabric from his shirt. He soaked it in vodka, then stuffed the rag in the bottle. He looked over at Troy and Linda and gave a slight shrug. Just in case, right? Then he slid the bottle carefully into the side pouch of his pack. Vodka wasn't an ideal fuel for a Molotov cocktail, but he heard that a high-proof alcohol could work in a pinch. They could no longer hear any movement outside, so they decided now was the time to make a move. Chris turned off his small light and gave his eyes a few minutes to adjust to the dark, before slipping out the front door. Peering around outside, he only saw the empty town of Bear River. No long-limbed monsters or giants in sight. Turning back, Chris waved the rest of the group forward, letting them know the coast was clear. The three of them jogged down the empty road, certain that the creatures were waiting to ambush them at any moment. Navigating the town had become far more difficult in the dark. The absence of the headlamp light made the world appear more sinister than before. Slowly, they managed to navigate their way back to the road that led out of town. Everyone's spirits began to lift just a bit, knowing that they were only a quarter-mile away from the van. However, this feeling faded just as quickly as it appeared. In the distance, a light manifested in the clearing. A bonfire had been lit and a congregation of the former townspeople had gathered. Standing in the center of the group was an impossibly tall man. He stood at least 4 feet over the crowd, like a cornstalk among weeds. It was hard to make out his features in the dim firelight, but the giant looked to be covered in a blanket of black feathers. Raising his hands, he began to speak in a tongue the world had forgotten long ago. But the crowd chanted with him, as if the strange words had been the lyrics to everyone's favorite song. The three of them stood, mesmerized by the display, filled with equal parts of horror and curiosity. However, a roar from behind them brought the group back into reality.
Growl.
Charging towards them was a pack of those monsters, their long limbs allowing them to close the distance quickly. The creatures raised their arms, brandishing clubs and rudimentary weapons. Sneaking by was no longer an option. They'd have to fight. Troy was the first to pull the trigger. The round caught the monster in front of the pack, causing it to tumble over. The rest of the pack jumped over their fallen comrade, undeterred by the threat of death. Linda and Chris fired into the crowd, an eruption of carnage that happened in a blur. Linda attempted to fire the rifle a third time, but was greeted with a light click instead of the thunderous boom of a round. Chris discharged the last couple of rounds he had left in his .38 before he too heard the sound of a dry fire. 4 dying creatures laid on the ground after the exchange, leaving 3 more heading towards them. The first creature to reach them brought his club down hard on Troy, knocking him to the ground. Chris and Linda rushed to help him, but ran straight into the other 2 monsters. The last thing Chris saw was a wooden table leg connect with his face before the world went dark. Opening his eyes again, Chris could see he was now in front of a bonfire. Looking over, he saw Troy and Linda kneeled in front of the giant. Their backpacks and firearms had been laid just a couple of feet away from him. Chris attempted to bolt towards his pack, but was quickly knocked back to the ground by the creature standing over him. It let out a low growl and poked him with his club, communicating that if he tried it again, there would be consequences. The giant spoke to Linda and Troy in its strange language. It almost sounded like it was asking them a question. It allowed the silence to hang in the air and raised its hands in a prayer-like motion. Then, in an instant, it slashed out in front of it, causing a trail of blood to appear on the ground. Troy was bleeding profusely from his neck, like a razor-sharp dagger had been dragged across it. He tried to use his hands to stop the flow, but it was an impossible task. Within mere moments, Troy fell to the ground, his remaining blood soaking into the cold soil. Linda cried out, but was quickly silenced by a strike from behind. The giant bent down and placed his hands on Troy's body. His corpse began to shake and thrash, like electricity was being run through him. Backing away from the body, the giant began to speak once again to the crowd. Then Troy stood up, as if his death was only a brief nap. But something deep down told Chris this was no longer the Troy he knew. Troy looked around and answered the crowd with a single call.
Grow.
The rest of the congregation joined him in this chant, as if the meaning of the universe was contained and celebrated in that one cry. They all looked up and roared this response to the heavens. This was his only chance. Chris ran towards his backpack, this time slipping by the distracted creature. He grabbed the bottle out of the pack and lit the rag with the lighter from his pocket. The creature noticed the sudden appearance of the flame, but it was too late to stop him. He threw the bottle at the giant, smashing it over its face. The vodka poured over it before being caught by the rag. A thunderous roar emerged from the giant as it retreated away from him. The town folks circled their giant god, protecting it from any further attacks. This gave them an opening to run. Chris grabbed the .38 from the ground and sprinted towards Linda. Seeing the opportunity as well, Linda shoved away the monster and bolted towards the tunnel. Grabbing a handful of bullets from his pocket, he attempted to load the .38 while running. He dropped most of them on the ground, but managed to load 3 rounds into the gun. Linda and Chris sprinted with all the speed they could muster. Their very lives depended on how quickly they could make this final stretch of the trip. The roar of the people could be heard behind him, changing from defending the giant to hunting them down. They didn't dare look behind them. The only focus had to be making it to the van. Chris was the first to reach the tunnel. He wanted to keep going, but he couldn't afford to lose another friend tonight. Turning around, he saw Linda just behind him. They were both out of breath, but it looked like they were going to make it. However, his heart sank as he discovered she was not the only person heading towards the tunnel. Troy was sprinting towards her, closing the distance with each step. He lunged at her, tackling Linda to the ground. She tried to break free from his grip, but couldn't escape the assault. Troy slammed his fist into Linda's face, causing blood to pour from her nose. Chris didn't want to do this. It felt like a betrayal of the highest order, but he didn't have a choice now. He leveled the revolver at Troy and pulled the trigger. An explosive blast erupted from the gun, sending Troy down on his back. Now he had to finish it, give his friend some kind of rest from this curse. He walked over to Troy, preparing to pull the trigger. He was twitching on the ground like he was trying to restart a failing motor. Chris held the gun over him, readying himself to deliver the coup de grace. With lightning speed, Troy shot up from the ground and knocked the gun out of Chris's hands. Wrapping his hands around Chris's neck, Troy began to squeeze with vice grip-like strength. Chris fought to pull away from him, but he was simply overmatched by this newfound strength. It felt like he was wrestling with a monster twice his size. As his oxygen reserves ran out, Chris fell to the ground. Troy went down with him, refusing to release his grip, similar in the way a starving animal won't let go of its lunch. His vision began to narrow. Unconsciousness was mere moments away. Then a second shot exploded to the side of him, sending a round through Troy's head. As if an off switch had been flipped, Troy released his grip and fell to the ground like a bag of laundry. The sudden release caused his lungs to fill with as much air as they could hold. He looked over and saw bloody Linda holding the revolver in front of her. Linda dropped the gun and gave him a hand, helping Chris back up on his feet. They both looked behind them. The rest of the townspeople were sprinting up the hill. Chris couldn't be sure, but he thought he saw the silhouette of the giant behind the crowd. They had no intention of meeting the townsfolk of Bear River again. Chris and Linda made the short jog to the van and started the vehicle. Chris reversed with a great deal of speed, turning the van back towards the main road and away from the tunnel. The two of them sat quietly in the van, trying to unpack the events that had just took place. Linda finally broke the silence. What do we tell Troy's mom? Chris shook his head. I can't think that far ahead yet, clearly overwhelmed with the many decisions that needed to be made. For now, I just want to put as many miles as possible between us and that godforsaken town. Growing up in a rural part of the state on a dirt road had a variety of pros and cons. The entire forest was pretty much our playground. We could spend all day outside and never cross the same path twice. The downside to all this space was the lack of people living in the area. This meant you really didn't have any neighbors, therefore as a kid, you didn't have a lot of options in the summer. In fact, the only neighbors we had were a mile and a half away. But I did spend pretty much every summer vacation with Kristen and her little brother Sam. One of the cons I never understood at the time was my grandpa's rule about playing outside. That as the sun went down, we needed to be back inside. And no matter what, we should never go into the woods at night. He always warned that lots of boys and girls go into those woods and never come back. Or at least they don't come back as themselves anymore. At the time, I just assumed Grandpa was a bit paranoid. After all, he moved in with my parents because they had serious doubts about his mental health and ability to take care of himself. He had lots of bizarre rules that I never questioned at the time, like never saying the worst possibility out loud, that I would speak it into existence if I was not careful. The last summer I hung out with Kristen and Sam, I had just turned 13. I was the oldest in our little group. Kristen was 12, and her little brother was 10. Kristen and I acted like we were so much more mature than Sam because we had been alive 2 and 3 years longer. But in reality, none of us really knew what we were doing. We were still in the process of figuring out what kind of person we would be. One of our favorite activities in the summer was going out to the edge of the woods and telling scary stories. The goal of the game was to tell the story that caused everyone else to run home. Getting crowned the Supreme Scare King was the highest honor one could obtain in the summer break. The very last time we played the game, everyone came with their best stories, and no one was running home. I'm not sure if it was because we were all older, or all parties involved wanted to win, but the game went on longer than expected. It ended in a draw, which was disappointing to say the least. But in that marathon of tales, we had lost track of time. The sun had set, and it was getting darker outside every passing minute. I broke my grandpa's most important rule: don't play outside when it was dark. At the time, I pushed away the fear, the uneasiness I was feeling. After all, I was 13. I thought I was pretty much an adult at this point. However, I could tell I was not the only one feeling uneasy about the coming night. Kristen and Sam had never stayed out this late either, so I offered to walk them back to their house. I felt somewhat responsible for the situation. I grabbed my backpack I had hung on a branch, and Sam got on his bike. We slowly navigated through the thick brush, heading back to the dirt road. My grandpa insisted that if I was going out into the woods, that I keep a few basic things with me. Water, flashlight, and a walkie. Keep in mind, this was before everyone had cell phones. And if I really needed help, he gave me a road flare. He insisted that it was for emergencies only and not to tell my parents about it. Now that I'm older, I question why he gave a kid a road flare. It was honestly a miracle I didn't burn down the entire property with it. However, I am thankful that I had it. Once we got out of the woods and back on the road, the sun had completely disappeared. Instead, it was replaced by the bright moon that provided the necessary amount of light to see a few feet in front of us. As the ground began to cool, a wispy fog rolled out from the tree line. It obscured my vision just enough to plague my imagination with thoughts of specters and monsters that danced just out of sight. No one wanted to talk as we walked down the dirt road. We must have all instinctively known that something else was in the woods that night. The first person to notice that things were off was Kristen. She was the more observant and cautious one of our little band. I'll never forget the stress in her voice when she said someone was following us. It freaked me out, but I just assumed we were a bit on edge. I fished out my flashlight from my backpack and flipped the switch. Pointing the light towards the trees, I couldn't find the mysterious stalker. It was as if the light had forced them away. However, I was certain I'd heard something moving back deeper into the woods, away from the illumination of the flashlight. I wasn't the only person who heard the movement in the woods. Suddenly Sam was panicked, pleading with Kristen and I to hurry up and leave. But something kept us fixed in place, mesmerized by the moment. Without knowing it, I turned off the flashlight, allowing the dark to retake the dirt road once again. To this day, I don't know why I turned off the light, but the child in the woods saw it as an invitation to come out. It was a girl about 8 or so, wearing a blue dress that had clumps of mud stuck to it. I couldn't put it together in the moment, but I was sure that I knew her from somewhere. The small girl in front of us would only make eye contact with the ground and let out light sobs in short intervals. The crying just felt wrong, like it was someone mimicking the act that had never experienced it. After a few uncomfortable minutes of silence, Kristen asked, "Are you lost?" The little girl nodded her head, still unwilling to look up from the ground. "My brother is hurt too. Can you come help me?" said the little girl. She pointed off behind her at the tree line. Although we were scared, we couldn't just leave someone that needed help. Sam ditched his bike on the road as the three of us walked into the woods, following behind the young girl. Keeping pace with her, I noticed she wasn't wearing shoes. I could only imagine how much her feet must be hurting, but she acted like it didn't bother her. She moved quickly with a spring in her step and had an almost gracefulness to her movements. The small girl in the blue dress kept looking back at us, checking to see that we were still following her. "He is just over here," said the small girl, pointing towards the clearing. Turning around to say this to our group caused her to lift up her head just a bit. Just enough for me to see her face. She must have noticed her mistake because she looked back at the ground right away. What I spotted in that split second were her eyes. They were black marbles, void of any color. Something about seeing them broke the spell. I started wondering why I was following someone I didn't know into the middle of the woods. I stopped Kristen and Sam from going any further. My interruption seemed to break them from the trance as well. Seeing us stopped caused the little girl in the blue dress to fly into a rage. "Why aren't you helping me? You need to follow me now," demanded the small child. Then I realized why I recognized the girl in the blue dress. She was on the local news every night as a missing kid a year ago. Everyone assumed she had been taken, but that was not the case. Or at least she was not taken by an individual. We all started to back away from her. As we did this, she got down on all fours and started to crawl towards us, making a low growling noise that intensified with each step we took backwards. Emerging from the clearing was multiple children that had been waiting. There must have been at least a dozen others, hiding, ready to ambush. All at once they sprinted towards us, letting out howling cries of sorrow and anger. It was as if they had all agreed on the moment of attack without speaking it. Kristen grabbed the flashlight from my hand and flipped the switch. The burst of light caused them all to scatter, as if the very beams burned their black marble eyes. Kristen and I both froze in place, unable to process the events that had just happened. It was Sam who pulled on both of us, saying, "We got to get back to the road." The fear in his voice was enough to get us all moving. Our legs pumped hard as we ran blindly through the dark forest, the flashlight barely guiding our way through the maze of trees. Just out of sight, I could hear the small footsteps of children following behind us, laughing and howling as if it was some kind of game they were playing with us. I still don't know how we managed to navigate those woods in the dark, but after what felt like running a marathon, we found ourselves back on the dirt road. Our first plan was for one of us to jump on Sam's bike and get help. However, upon inspection, something had ripped the chain off and nearly bent the front wheel in half. It was clear that the children had no intention of letting us escape. Then I remembered the walkie I kept in my pack. Turning it on, I radioed my grandpa, hoping that he was at his ham radio tonight. I heard a staticky response from him before it went dead. I forgot to change out the batteries on the walkie and the flashlight. It had been over a year since I had checked them. Looking at the bulb of the flashlight, I could tell it was getting dimmer, and the creatures in the woods seemed to be aware of it as well. We could hear them circling just out of sight, somewhere along the brush beside the road. There were no houses within a mile of us, which meant all they had to do was wait out our failing light. At the moment, a plan came to mind, but the idea of executing it terrified me. I was the fastest runner in our little group. I could get back to my house within 10 minutes if I booked it. Maybe, if I left the light with Kristen and Sam, the creatures would follow me instead. I wasn't sure I could outrun the forest children, but I felt like I had the best shot. If I made it, I could get my grandpa to drive his truck up the road and pick up Kristen and Sam before the light gave out. They were not a fan of my plan. Sam insisted that we should stick together. I remember him saying splitting up only worked on Scooby-Doo. I told them I didn't want to go by myself, but I was the only one who could make the run in one go. And if we were lucky, they would follow the person without the light, giving them a chance to escape. Kristen had the idea that they would run the opposite direction towards their house. She said it was a way to hedge their bets, but I didn't understand what that meant at the time. In that moment of terror and panic, I learned a life lesson that stuck with me till this very day. Talking about doing something and doing it are two very different things. I started to run down the dirt road towards my house, while Kristen and Sam took off the other direction. The first thing I noticed was how much the world had changed with the absence of the flashlight. I was plunged back into a lightless night. It was difficult to run at full speed because I was uncertain of every step. However, the children did not suffer from unsure footing. I could hear the pack running towards me and abandoning the chase with Kristen and Sam. In a way, I was excited the plan had worked. It wasn't like I was certain on any part of it. On the other hand, it also meant I was now literally running for my life. Once my eyes adjusted to the moonlight, I became more confident in my stride. However, I could hear the pack of lost children closing the distance. They called from just behind me to stop running, that they wanted to play. I didn't dare look back. I knew if I turned for a moment, I could trip on the uneven road. With each passing breath, I could hear the footfalls growing louder, the torrent of cries, laughter, and growls getting closer to me. I tried to pick up my pace, to run faster, but I was already running as quickly as my frame would allow. These creatures had unending endurance and determination. Sprinting down the hill of a bend, what I feared finally happened. Their unnatural speed had caught up to me. A single hand managed to grab my leg, causing me to fall face forward. I tried to use my hands to catch myself, but it was impossible to stop my momentum. I dragged on my hands and face before flipping over on my back. At the time, I didn't feel the pain. Instead, I jumped back on my feet, ignoring the blood that was dripping down my face. However, that brief stop was enough time for the group to circle around me. They slowly closed the circle, making sure I didn't have a path of escape. I slipped off my backpack and prepared to use it as a weapon. It was the only thing I had on hand. The zipper was slightly undone, and now that it was in front of me, I could see the emergency flare. I grabbed the flare and threw my backpack at the one in front of me. The creature easily dodged out of the way, but it caused the rest of the group to pause for a moment, to reevaluate the plan of attack. Taking off the cap, I started to strike the end of the flare, trying to repeat the process I'd watched my grandpa do numerous times. Each failed strike caused the forest children to become bolder and move closer to me. I knew I was only moments away from being taken. I assumed that they would somehow turn me into one of them, a lifeless shell of my former self, stalking the forest each night to lure in more children to the pack. Just as a hand grabbed my arm, the final strike caused a brilliant light to be born. A cacophony of cries filled my ears, and the creatures covered their face, as if the flare had ignited the very air around us. And just as quickly as they had appeared, the creatures retreated back into the woods. I found myself once again alone on the dirt road. My arms and legs now had black handprints from where the creatures had grabbed me. It was as if their very touch drained the life from their victims. To this day, I still have the faded imprints on my skin, a permanent reminder of that night. After walking down the dirt road a bit further, I found my grandpa driving his truck. He had gotten the radioed message and was out looking for me. I jumped in the passenger seat and explained that we had to get Kristen and Sam. We sat silently in the truck. I had this feeling that I didn't need to explain it to him. He already knew what was in the forest, and I had just gotten my education in the subject. We found Kristen and Sam a mile away. The flashlight had nearly gone out. They were scared, but they were safe. My grandpa dropped them off at their house, and then we headed back home. We never told scary stories in the woods again. After all, what story could we ever tell that would compare to what we experienced? Without this activity keeping us together, we slowly lost touch. Years later, when my grandpa was in the hospital, I asked him if he knew what the children in the forest are, and how did they come into existence. His answer still haunts me to this day. He said the children had always been there, that they were as old as humanity itself, that as soon as we managed to turn on the lights, we pushed them into the uninhabited parts of the world. Then, we forgot they existed. In our arrogance, we assumed we had total dominion over the world. But the creatures of the night are waiting for us to stumble into their realm. And one day, when the lights of our world fail, they will come for us again. Andrew rounded the curve of the dirt road, pedaling fast on his new bike. He wanted to see how much speed he could get, and if it was really faster than his older one. He had saved up for it over the summer, and he needed to prove to himself that it was worth the work. Going down a hill caused the air to rush by him, drowning out the sound of the woods. A slight smile grew on his face as the bike picked up speed. It was the last week of summer, which was certainly a bummer, but the cool evening air and the prospect of doing something exciting helped soften the blow. In the distance, he could see his friends, Corey and Liz. Well, friends was a placeholder term in his mind for those two. The only thing Andrew really had in common with them was his age,
living in the same neighborhood, and wanting to break the rules to try something new. Sometimes Andrew was uncomfortable with what Corey and Liz found fun. Last week, they thought it'd be funny to set Mr. Brown's new shed on fire. They laughed and howled from a distance as they watched that old man try to save his shed with a garden hose that was too short to reach the blaze. It was hard to change friends at the age of 13, but Andrew decided he was going to do his best at the start of the school year. "Look who finally decided to show up. You've been ignoring me for like a week, man," said Corey as Andrew pulled up. "I told you guys in the group chat that I had to stay at my dad's house. I just got back," replied Andrew. It came out a bit more defensive than he had intended. He had only stayed at his dad's place for a couple of days, not the entire week. Andrew really just wanted the break to figure things out. But then they started talking about exploring Dead Man's Ditch before the end of summer. And the most exciting part of all was that they would come out here at night. As uncertain as he was about his friendship with Corey and Liz, the desire to end his boredom was too strong of a pull. Andrew didn't want to spend the last few days of summer staring at his cell phone. In order to pull this off, they had to coordinate a lie so that their parents wouldn't know that they had snuck out. Andrew told his mom that he was staying with Corey tonight, and Corey told his parents that he was staying the night at Andrew's place. Liz's parents seemed to be completely unconcerned with what she did each day. It was strange that they never asked any questions, but it made her a fun person to be around. She was pretty much up for anything, but we all secretly suspected she never wanted to go home. Andrew jumped off his bike and leaned it against the tree. "All right, we ready to do this thing?" Corey and Liz both exchanged a sinister glance. The reaction was identical to the one they had made right before setting the shed on fire. At last, Liz broke the uncomfortable silence. "We have a special guest on the way," said Liz. "Who?" asked Andrew nervously. "I invited Faye to come with us," answered Liz with a giggle. Andrew didn't understand it, but he knew that they had bad intentions. Corey and Liz often made Faye the punchline of their jokes. They would do things like throw her backpack on top of the school, or remove her homework from a stack of papers on the teacher's desk. It was cruel, but no one wanted to stand up for Faye, not even the teachers. To put it simply, Faye was a little strange. She would often mumble to herself at the back of the classroom, and would sometimes break out into fits of shouting and sobbing. But Andrew got the feeling that some of the adults in the school got creeped out by Faye. One time he heard Faye tell Miss Baxter that her cat had just passed away. The next day, Miss Baxter came in so angry, he thought she was going to hit her. The principal had to come to the classroom and calm down the situation. Miss Baxter was certain that Faye had hurt her cat, but Andrew was not convinced. Faye lived on the same street as him, and he was pretty certain she never left her home. The world had rejected her, so she often chose to stay indoors. However, that need for human connection is strong, even among the people we deem as outsiders. Andrew knew that Faye, like everyone else, needed friends. She was going to show up, despite the fact that Corey and Liz had terrorized her every day at school. Andrew felt like he had to play it cool. He didn't want to ruin his last outing of the summer. "Why did you invite her, Liz? We don't even like Faye," said Andrew. "Because we're going to teach her a lesson," chimed in Corey. Andrew's stomach knotted up at that response. His instincts had been correct. "Didn't you think it was weird that the teachers somehow knew we were about to skip school on the last day? Well, I heard from Carrie that she heard Faye telling the teachers on us. I don't know how that little freak knew about our plans, but it really messed up our perfect start to summer. Well, she is going to learn to keep her nose out of other people's business," said Liz, with a big smile. "Let's go. I don't want to wait around here forever," said Andrew, trying to find a way to avoid this disaster. "Don't be a little punk," growled Corey, punching Andrew's arm with enough force to cause him to take a step back. "You gotta learn to stand up to people that want to mess with you, dude. All we're doing here is evening the scoreboard." He chuckled like that line was the most brilliant thing he had ever said. Andrew rubbed his sore arm and thought about Corey's standpoint. He came to the conclusion that the scoreboard certainly favored the home team by a large margin. If anything, Faye tattling on them didn't even come close to evening things up. In the distance, he could see Faye running down the dirt road towards them. Her amber hair whipped wildly in the wind as she waved at the group gathered outside the entrance to Dead Man's Ditch. "Right on time," whispered Corey with a snicker. Liz stepped in front of the group and waved back at Faye. She was the first person to greet Faye, but Andrew wanted no part in this little plot. He kept his eyes fixed to the ground, a wave of shame punching him hard in the chest. "Hey girl, how have you been this summer?" said Liz with a sing-song voice. She gave Faye a hug, which seemed completely out of character for her. "Doing well," replied Faye, still trying to catch her breath after running such a long distance. "Thank you for inviting me." "Of course, I've been telling the boys that we need more women in our merry little group," said Liz with a wink. This response caused a huge smile to grow on Faye's face, obviously overjoyed at being accepted by other people. It was like watching someone dying of thirst finally get a drink of water. It was a mystery to Andrew how they could get enjoyment out of this game. All he really wanted to do was leave, but maybe he could soften the blow of what would happen next, or at least keep things from getting out of hand. "Alright guys, are we ready or what?" interjected Andrew, the annoyance obvious in his voice. "Yeah, let's go," said Corey as he picked up a stick off the ground. The group of four stepped off the road and onto the thin forest path. They passed a sign that said in big, bold letters, "Keep out." The paint was beginning to peel on the sign, giving it a creepy, distorted appearance. Andrew was the first person to break the silence. "Is this private property?" "Nah, my old man said the town owns it. Was supposed to be a hiking trail, but it turned out to be too dangerous," replied Corey. "Yeah, I was talking to Carrie and she said, people go missing all the time," added Liz, purposely trying to make her voice low and creepy. Everyone but Faye gave a slight chuckle. Faye cleared her voice and decided to take part in the conversation. "I wrote a research paper about this area. Originally the town was going to be built here, but something made those settlers change their mind and abandon that idea. According to the Native Americans, this was bad land to settle. I think the rough translation of their description was sick land." "That ain't true," said Corey. "The land was abandoned because the miners got spooked. Nothing scary about it." Andrew rolled his eyes listening to Corey try to pretend he wasn't scared. Every kid in school told ghost stories about Dead Man's Ditch, and the way to prove yourself to the school was to come out here and take a picture next to it. The adults of the town didn't want us coming out here. A lot of kids had fallen and gotten stuck in the muddy bottom, but a few of those kids who made it back told a different story, one that frightened Andrew just to think about. Some of the kids that returned said that they didn't fall. Something had dragged them down into it. "Why did the settlers dig this ditch anyways?" asked Andrew, wanting to change the subject. "It formed naturally," answered Faye. "When they built the dam, it diverted most of the water and caused the river to dry out." "Well, don't you just have all the answers?" said Corey mockingly. Liz giggled at the jab and Faye lowered her head, trying to hide her face under her amber hair. "Nah, that is a cool thing to know, Faye. Thanks," replied Andrew. Faye raised her head again, and a slight smile was now on her face. Corey and Liz seemed annoyed by Andrew's compliment and began to pick up their pace to put some distance between the two of them. He could hear them whispering back and forth, but couldn't quite make out any exact words. He decided this was a good opportunity to get some answers for himself. "Hey, Faye, did you tell the teachers that we planned on skipping the last day of school?" asked Andrew in a low voice. The smile disappeared from Faye's face and a look of concern replaced it. She swallowed hard before answering. "I did, but I did it to help Liz." "How did tattling help Liz?" Faye was silent for a moment. It was obvious that she was struggling to come up with an answer. She began to stutter as she let the words pour out of her mouth. I see things that haven't happened yet sometimes. Liz was going to get hurt real bad. Andrew considered the response, trying to find a place for it in his 13-year-old perspective. Like a superpower? Asked Andrew. Yeah, sort of, but I don't think people like it. My mom told me that people don't like what they don't understand, and a gift like that creates questions they don't want to ask. She said it was best that I didn't tell anyone about it. Andrew wondered if it was possible to know about things before they had happened. Faye did seem to know about their plan to skip school, and they had been careful not to tell anyone. Well, next time just tell me. I would have listened to what you had to say. Faye nodded at Andrew, and they continued walking down the path to Dead Man's Ditch. As the group rounded the bend of the trail, Corey was the first to spot it. In the middle of the woods was a van that had clearly been stuck for some time. Surprisingly, the glass was still intact, but pockets of rust had started to take hold of a couple of spots. Jumping into the driver's seat, Corey tried to move the steering wheel, but found it no longer functioned. The seats in the back of the van had started to degrade as well, with springs sticking out at random spots. "Why the hell is this van out here?" said Liz. Andrew shrugged. "I heard some people from the high school like to hang out here too. Guess it got stuck in the mud and they left it?" Corey jumped out and laughed. "Yeah, I'd leave this dumpster in the woods too." Reaching out her hand and touching the van, Faye let out a slight whimper. She looked back and forth like her head was tracking the movement of something no one else could see. "It is starting to get dark. Maybe we should head back," said Faye. "What? We're about to be at the ditch," replied Corey. He crossed his arms and leaned against the van, doing his best to look unimpressed. "I thought you were cool," said Liz. "Guess you can't hang out with us." Andrew could tell Faye was really considering her options. Something about the van freaked her out, but Liz's words had cut deep. This was the first time she'd hung out with people her own age in years. "Okay, I can stay a bit longer," said Faye defeatedly. Corey and Liz both cheered as they continued down the path to Dead Man's Ditch, but Andrew was not as thrilled as the rest of the gang. He knew about Faye's ability. He had even seen her use it with Miss Baxter, and if Faye was scared, then maybe they should be scared as well. He suddenly snapped out of his trance as he saw Faye walk up to him. She clutched his hand tightly and looked at him with a serious gaze that he had only seen from teachers and his parents. "Did you mean what you said?" asked Faye. "Mean what?" That you would listen to me if I told you about something that could happen." Andrew nodded his head in response. "Okay, if I say run, you have to run too. I think this place may be dangerous," said Faye. Although normally he considered himself pretty brave compared to his friends, Faye's words frightened him. They illuminated something he knew deep down as well, that something was sick inside of these woods, and people with good sense had left a long time ago. "You coming or what?" yelled Corey. Faye and Andrew both looked up at the trail and began to jog towards the rest of the group. It was getting dark now, and it was starting to get hard to see. Each step had to be taken carefully or risk tripping over a rock or root. Luckily, Corey and Andrew had cell phones with them. They turned on the light to help guide them the last few feet towards the ditch. The woods opened up into a clearing of a dried-out river. Time had cut this wound into the earth, leaving a channel that was close to 6 feet deep. Thin veins of water ran into the gash of land, causing the mud below to remain wet, but never enough to revive the river back to its former glory. The bottom was covered in beer bottles and cans that had been collected from teenagers looking for a spot to drink away from the town. Corey stepped up to the edge and looked down at the muddy bottom. "I don't see what the big deal is. It's not scary." Liz smirked and turned towards Andrew and Faye. "Well, it won't be scary for us, but I'd be terrified if I was you, Faye. The confusion on her face was clear. She had absolutely no idea that this was a setup. What? Stuttered Faye. You think you can tell the teachers on me and I'm just gonna let it go? Said Liz. Corey decided this was his moment to get in on the fun as well, stepping up to Faye and pushing her onto the ground. Dead Man's Ditch is where we go to bury the snitch. Corey and Liz howled like this was the best joke ever told. Suddenly, droplets of blood started to flow from Faye's head. She closed her eyes and let out a slight whimper. Corey began to back up, obviously confused by the situation. I barely touched her, said Corey defensively. Andrew ran up and bent down to check her for injuries. She seemed to be fine, but he could see her eyes moving rapidly behind her eyelids. It was like she was stuck in some kind of trance. He began to shake her back and forth, trying to snap her out of whatever was happening. At last, Faye opened her eyes and stood up quickly from the ground. He could tell she was confused, but also frightened. We have to go, said Faye, the fear obvious in her voice. We ain't going anywhere until we get this settled, replied Liz. I told the teacher to help you, Liz. Your dad was going to catch you skipping and beat you so bad that you ended up in the hospital. All the laughing and snickering suddenly stopped. Corey and Andrew both looked at Liz, trying to figure out how she would react. We all sort of suspected that things hadn't been right in Liz's home for some time, but Andrew knew it was a sore subject. The last time someone made fun of a bruise she had on her wrist, Liz beat the holy hell out of that girl. Liz's eyes narrowed and her mawkish smile quickly turned into a scowl. Faye had seen something that she wanted to keep secret, and now it was out and in the open. It made her feel weak and vulnerable. This was a sin that had to be paid for in her mind. Corey, push that little freak into the ditch. He looked confused by the request, almost certain that he hadn't heard her correctly. I thought we were going to scare her a bit. Don't be such a coward. You act so tough all the time until something really has to be done. Faye tried to crawl away from the situation, but Corey saw the movement and snatched her leg. He then began to drag her towards the edge of the ditch. Andrew was stunned for a moment. He couldn't believe they were really going to do it, but something deep down told him that this was wrong. Faye hadn't done anything that deserved this kind of punishment. You don't understand. Something else is in these woods. It's a miner that never left. The land turned him into something evil, screamed Faye. However, her warning fell on uncaring ears. Stop it, yelled Andrew as he charged towards Corey. The sudden attack caught him off guard and caused him to let go of Faye. Now Corey was grappling with Andrew, trying to force him away, but the temporary advantage quickly passed. Corey had hit his growth spurt a bit earlier than everyone else. Andrew discovered that he was overmatched by his opponent's size and strength. He managed to shove Andrew away, then caught him on the mouth with a fist that sent him to the ground. Suddenly Andrew could taste pennies, and a thin trail of blood was coming from his lip. An angry Corey grabbed Faye by the hair, preparing to finish the job he had started. He forced her up onto her feet, then shoved her hard into the ditch, causing her to scream as she fell backwards into the muddy bottom below. See, nothing to it, said Corey with a wink. Liz clapped and cheered for him, as if Corey was some returning hero. Andrew tried to get back to his feet, but was slammed back into the ground by Corey's foot. Thing is, I was cool with you, growled Corey, but now I gotta teach you a lesson too. He pressed his foot hard into Andrew's back, pinning him to the ground. Send him into the ditch, howled Liz, with a manic laugh. Andrew was certain he was about to be tossed into the muddy bottom as well, but something caused everyone to freeze in place. A deep roar echoed through the forest. The sound hung heavy in the air. What the hell was that? Said Corey, a bit of fear breaking the tough guy act. Let's go, said Liz, motioning for Corey to follow her. What about Faye? Asked Andrew. He managed to get out from under Corey's foot and crawl to the side of a tree. What about her? If you like her so much, why don't you help her out? And with those words, Corey and Liz took off down the trail, but Andrew noticed they took the wrong path. He decided this was a good thing. He didn't want to run into them on the way out. Another roar erupted from the forest. However, this time it sounded a bit closer. All he wanted to do was run, get to his bike and get home. But he knew Faye was stuck in the ditch, and he couldn't just leave her behind. He crawled over to the side of the ditch and looked down. He could see Faye was below, covered in mud and knee-deep in it. She was trying to lift her legs, but the suction of the wet ground was making it difficult to move. "Are you okay?" asked Andrew. "I can't move," replied a panicked Faye. He looked around for something he could use to pull her out, but the only thing he could find was a hiking stick and a couple of large, flat stones. Andrew tossed the stones down into the mud next to Faye. Some of the water splashed on her, but she didn't seem to notice. He then picked up the stick and slid down the ditch. Instantly, Andrew found he was covered in the thick mud, but managed to land on the stones he had tossed below. The flat surface distributed his weight just enough to prevent him from sinking. He then stuck the stick into the side of the ditch wall and used it to keep himself balanced. Using his other hand to grasp Faye's arm, he attempted to pull her up. Slowly, she began to get to her feet, free from the sinking soil, and got one hand on a stone. Andrew grabbed her shirt and pulled her with all of his might to try to bring her up to him. Suddenly, she was free, and the two of them crashed into the side of the muddy ditch. They both let out a slight laugh, happy that they had solved one problem, but knew another was around the corner. Now they had to try to figure out how to climb out of this thing. Andrew tried to climb up the side, but he failed to get any traction. The mud was slick and the side of the ditch was smooth. He was preparing himself for another attempt, but he saw a figure that made him freeze in place. Faye snatched Andrew by the arm and pulled him to face her. She put a single finger over her mouth and whispered the words, "Be quiet, he can't see." A tall, thin man covered in rags stood at the top of the ditch, just over Andrew and Faye. His eye sockets were dried out and empty. His skin was pale in the moonlight, with faint wisps of hair hanging from his head. The creature sniffed the air, like a dog searching for a meal. Andrew was sure the thing had spotted them, but as Faye had said, it appeared the thin monster couldn't see. It used sound and smell to hunt. Suddenly, the creature's head snapped towards the trail, taking in deep intakes of air through its nostrils. It let loose an ear-deafening roar before charging towards the trail and into the forest. Andrew was in a state of shock, trying to figure out what the hell he had just seen. Faye snapped him out of it, bringing him back to the current problem. "It's gone now. I think the mud helped hide her scent, but it picked up Corey and Liz's trail," said Faye. "What is that thing?" whispered Andrew. Faye considered the question for a moment before responding. "When I fell on the ground, I saw that man in my mind. I think he was a miner who got stuck out here after the area was abandoned. He should have starved to death, but the land kept him alive, made him into that monster." The manner in which Faye explained it seemed so calm. He got the feeling that this was not the first monster she had seen in her visions. It made him wonder just how common it was to find these things in the world. "If we are going to make it, we have to get out," said Faye. Andrew knew this was now a life or death situation. The adrenaline spike gave him the energy to jump up and claw at the side of the ditch. He managed to get a hold of a root which gave him enough traction to get his hands on the edge and pull himself up. He took a minute to catch his breath and laid on his stomach and reached out his hands for Faye. She was able to grab the root and get a hold of Andrew's arm. With his help, she grabbed the edge and pulled herself out of the ditch. They both laid on the ground, covered in mud and winded, but at last free from the sinking soil. It was a small victory, but now the real test was going to begin. They had to avoid the monster that hunted the woods of Dead Man's Ditch. Faye and Andrew began the trek back to the main trail. Andrew turned on his phone's flashlight to help him see the path. He checked for a signal, but they were too deep in the forest for the cell towers to reach them. Unlike Corey and Liz, they took the correct path back. However, it was not Andrew leading the way. Faye was the one telling him which way to go. He wasn't sure if she just had a good memory or if this was part of her gift. In the distance, they could hear the sound of the creature thrashing through the forest, looking for the lost kids. It sounded like they were getting closer to the monster, but what choice did they have at this point? This was the only way back. Looking at Faye, Andrew observed that she was moving through the forest with her eyes closed. He suspected that she was using her vision to see a few steps ahead, just like she had done with Miss Baxter's cat, and warned us about the monster in the woods. Suddenly, Faye clutched Andrew's arm, preventing him from going any further. "Wait," whispered Faye. Standing in the dark, Andrew looked around for what she had seen that caused them to stop. The forest had grown quiet, as if it too was waiting for something to happen. Then a flash of movement came from the tree line. Corey and Liz emerged on the path, breathing heavily and a look of terror etched on their faces. The off-trail route had caused them to be covered with small scratches on their face and arms, but they seemed to be relatively uninjured. They exchanged a single glance before an ear-piercing screech broke the moment and caused them to flee again into the woods. A few seconds later, the monster crawled out of the forest on all four, its long limbs moving its thin frame quickly towards its prey. Once it disappeared from sight, Faye released his arm. "Okay, it's safe now." They both started again at a slow jog. Climbing out of the ditch had taken a physical toll. Andrew doubted that they could outrun that creature that hunted the woods at this point. It was lucky that Corey and Liz seemed to be keeping the thing distracted for now. Although he knew Corey and Liz were in trouble, he didn't have room for those thoughts in his mind. All Andrew could think about was his own survival and Faye's. After a few minutes of running, they at last spotted a landmark he could remember seeing. The rusted van set in the middle of the woods, its reason for being here a bit more obvious now. Andrew was relieved to see it. That meant the road home was near. Now all they had to do was make it a bit further. They could jump on his bike and get out of here. He wondered if he could outrun the creature on his bike, but the way home was slightly uphill. He hoped he wouldn't have to learn the answer. Picking up his speed, Andrew went past the van and onto the thin trail that would take them to the road. He noticed Faye was not following him. Instead, she stood next to the van, fixated on the rusted vehicle. "We are almost out. Let's go," said Andrew. Faye shook her head and answered, "We won't make it." The response caused a wave of panic to pass over him. What did she know that he didn't? "But the road is so close, we can make it." Faye opened the door to the van and jumped inside. All of his instincts screamed at him to flee, that the road to safety was so near, but a single thought kept him from abandoning his new friend. A very adult thought for someone at the age of 13. That he had some blame to accept for what was happening. The guilt he felt was nearly overwhelming at the moment. Not for Corey and Liz, they made their choices. Andrew felt he should have done more to warn Faye, and now he was considering abandoning her and making a run for it. Instead, he turned around and jumped into the van with Faye. Faye gave him a big smile when he came inside. Clearly, she was unsure if he would continue to follow her. He suspected her vision didn't allow her to view every single detail of what would happen next, that people's choices could change the way that things would happen. "Can you see what will happen next?" Faye shrugged, pushing her hair out of her face. "Sometimes what I see gets fuzzy. It's like watching a movie that slowly changes into a new one. What we have done has changed things, and I think it takes time to catch up. All I know for sure is if we continue down that path, the miner catches us on your bike. Hiding makes my sight fuzzy, which means what happens next is uncertain." Andrew closed the door to the van and locked it. "Then let's wait it out," replied Andrew. Now that he was taking a moment to catch his breath and think, he understood her visions a bit better. She didn't have perfect control over it, and it sounded like Faye didn't always get to pick what she saw. It may have been why she didn't know Corey and Liz had it out for her. Hey, sorry I didn't tell you about Corey and Liz. They kinda suck. Yeah, but thanks for not leaving me in the ditch. Faye looked down at the rusted floor of the van, kicking her legs out. Are we still going to be friends if we get out of here? Oh yeah, you're like a superhero. We're a team now. Andrew held his fist up to Faye, clearly waiting for her to do something. Faye looked at his hand, confused about what was expected next. Bump it, said Andrew. Faye brought up her fist and touched it against his hand. Andrew then pulled his hand back and made a mawkish explosion sound. This caused the tension to leave the air, and Faye let out a slight giggle. Suddenly, the world felt a little less scary. Then, Andrew saw a sight that caused his heart to sink into his stomach. Corey was running up to the van. He looked like he had been through hell, but was not hurt. Corey slammed into the side of the door, and he immediately locked eyes with Andrew. Open the door, yelled Corey. His voice was angry and demanding. He pulled hard on the latch, but the lock was keeping the door firmly in place. Andrew began to reach for the lock, but his hand was caught on something. Looking down, he could see Faye was stopping him from opening the door. You can't. I know he's a jerk, but shouldn't we help him? If we open the door, we die too, replied Faye. It's already got Liz, and now it'll take Corey too. As soon as she finished speaking, the creature's hand suddenly shot up from under the van and grabbed Corey. Andrew had to fight back the urge to scream. Tears began to build up around his eyes. Please, pleaded Corey, but Andrew knew he was beyond help now. In one swift motion, Corey was dragged to the ground, firmly clutched by the monster's sick, long arms. It let out a roar of victory, then dragged Corey away into the tree line. And just as quickly as the chaos had started, the forest had returned to an eerie silence. It's distracted now. Here is our chance, said Faye. She unlocked the door and jumped out of the van, looking around the forest tree line. He wanted to move, but Andrew was frozen in place by fear. He had to watch Corey get dragged away out of nowhere. No warning, no explanation, just suddenly gone. Andrew feared that could be him at any moment. We only make it out if you leave. You gotta trust me, pleaded Faye. He was scared to death, but he knew she was right. He nodded his head and crawled out of the van and back into the wild world. Faye gave him a somewhat awkward thumbs up, then motioned for him to follow her. Andrew and Faye took off towards the trail. The short rest helped restore some of their energy, allowing them to run at a sprint. The trees whipped past him in a blur, and the only thing he could focus on was his feet and keeping the phone flashlight in front of him. Andrew was certain that those long arms would reach out for him any second, grabbing and dragging him away like Corey. But each step forward gave him a bit more hope, that they would make it out of the forest alive. After what felt like forever, Faye and Andrew spotted the dirt road home. This was it. They had actually made it out and escaped that thing in the woods. Andrew grabbed his bike off of the ground and they began to run up the hill of the road. They were both tired, but the more distance they could put between them and Dead Man's Ditch, the better. Reaching the top, they both nearly fell over from the run. Neither of them could say a word for a few minutes. The only thing they could do was take in as much air as possible. Andrew's lungs burned from the activity. This was the longest he had ever ran in his life. Finally, Andrew was able to spit out a few words. I never want to go into that forest again. Faye nodded her head, unable to speak but agreeing with the thought. Think you can jump on the back of my bike and we can ride home? Asked Andrew. Faye nodded her head, still taking in deep, ragged breaths of air, and unable to speak. They both jumped onto Andrew's bike and began to pedal away from the woods. It was taking a lot more effort to gain momentum with two people on the bike, but Andrew knew the hill was just around the corner. Finally, Faye had caught enough of her wind back that she was able to speak again. You have to make it to the crossroads. Her voice sounded urgent, like she knew something was about to happen. Andrew turned around and spotted the creature at the bottom of the hill. It was running on all four limbs towards them. It was silent and quick, attempting to close the distance before the two of them knew it was coming. Andrew doubled his efforts and began to pedal even harder, slowly picking up speed. He was not sure if he could outrun this thing, but the bike was their best shot. All he could do now was focus on making it to the crossroads. Once they started going downhill, the bike picked up even more speed. Now the extra weight was working with them. Andrew ducked down his head to try to create less drag from the wind. They couldn't turn around to see, but they could hear the thud of hands and feet just behind them. The low growl of the creature caused the hair to stand up on the back of his neck. The thing must have been only a few feet away. The bike was going as fast as possible now. He was pretty sure pedaling wasn't adding any more speed at this point. He concentrated on keeping the bike on the road. Spilling over would be a fatal mistake, one that he couldn't afford to make. He barely managed to take a sharp turn. The bike slid on the loose dirt road. This allowed the creature to gain on the two young teens.
Mine,
hissed the creature. The word shocked Andrew. It sounded like it was just behind his ear. Then he spotted the crossroad, the one Faye told him to reach. He didn't know how this would stop that thing, but at this point he had complete trust in her. Also, what choice did he have now? Summoning the last bit of energy he had left, Andrew pedaled hard on the bike. Just as he was about to reach the crossroads, he saw a pickup truck driving recklessly fast towards them and clearly unconcerned with a stop sign coming up. Normally Andrew would have bailed off the bike at this point, but he knew stopping meant being grabbed by the creature. He would have to chance it. He closed his eyes and tried to beat the truck to the other side. He didn't know if they would make it or be crushed by the speeding vehicle. He heard the sound of brakes squealing and gravel being thrown away from sliding tires. The truck slammed hard into something heavy, and a roar of pain erupted from behind them. Opening his eyes, Andrew could see he had made it to the other side. Turning around, he saw the creature had been run over by the truck and was crawling away to the forest, leaving a black trail of ooze behind it. Rather than stop, Andrew kept pedaling away from the crossroads. He didn't know if the creature would continue the chase or not, but he wasn't taking that chance. The further he could get from this place, the better. After an uneventful ride back to his neighborhood, Faye and Andrew jumped off the bike and onto their street. Neither one of them had spoken during the entire trip. He was at his limit and didn't really know what to say. But now that they were safely home, he had a ton of things that he wanted to ask. Like if Faye knew about the truck saving them, or that Corey and Liz wouldn't make it home. The thought spawned the first of many questions he was going to ask over the years about tonight. "What do we tell people about Corey and Liz?" asked Andrew. Faye considered the question, cocking her head up and looking at the night sky. "Not much we can say. No one will believe us." "But we both saw it. They have to know." Faye shook her head in disagreement. "I've seen other things too, and some people are not ready to know about them. This world is stranger than we want to accept." Andrew wondered if this was why so many people treated Faye badly. She created questions that no one wanted to ask. But Faye no longer had to ask those questions alone. Andrew would be there for her in the future. Ghastly here. If you're at the end of the video, I assume you're a fan of my work. The best way to support my content is to like this video and leave a comment. I think this helps push it through the YouTube algorithm, which can be a bit difficult to navigate at times. Also, if you're new, consider subscribing for more scary stories.